We had planned a camping trip for weeks, a group of 5 friends eager to escape the noise of our daily lives and spend a few days in the woods. It was supposed to be a simple getaway, some hiking, a little fishing, and long nights by the campfire telling stories. Nothing fancy, just the quiet of nature and the company of close friends. But that night, something changed. We arrived at the site just as the sun began to dip behind the trees. The camp was tucked away in a secluded corner of the forest, miles from the nearest town. The air felt fresh, almost unnervingly so, but we were used to that. After setting up the tents and starting the campfire, we cracked open some beers and settled in. We joked and laughed as the fire crackled, casting shadows that danced on the trees around us. As the night wore on, the forest grew still. The usual chirping of crickets and rustling of small creatures had fallen silent, replaced by an oppressive quiet. It was the kind of silence that crawls under your skin, making every little noise seem louder, sharper. I noticed it first, a small sound, barely perceptible, like something brushing against the leaves. I thought it was nothing at first, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel, but the others had caught it too. I looked over at my friend Max. He had his hand on his flashlight, his knuckles white. "Did you hear that?" he asked. We all froze, straining to listen. A branch snapped somewhere deep in the woods. Then nothing. A cold shiver crept down my spine. "Probably just an animal," Sarah said, trying to sound calm, but I could hear the tremor in her voice. She wasn't fooling anyone. We sat in uneasy silence, staring into the fire, every one of us too nervous to speak. Then came the first scream. It was high-pitched, not the kind of scream you hear when someone's hurt, but the kind that chills your blood. A distant scream, like a woman's voice. The sound carried through the trees and stopped abruptly. We jumped to our feet, hearts racing. Max was already reaching for his backpack, fumbling for the map, his face pale. "Maybe it's someone else camping out here," he said, though none of us believed him. That scream was too loud, too close. I whispered. My voice didn't sound like my own. It was thin, almost like I was trying to convince myself it wasn't real. Without thinking, we grabbed flashlights and headed toward the source of the sound. The trees were thick, and the shadows seemed to twist and shift unnaturally as we walked. Each step felt heavier, like the forest itself was resisting us. The scream came again, closer this time. A horrible, shrieking wail that tore through the air. We broke into a run, pushing through the underbrush, our breaths ragged, and then we saw it, a figure, hunched over by a tree, facing away from us. The shape was tall, unnaturally thin, its arms too long. It was scraping something on the ground, a slow, rhythmic motion that sent a fresh wave of dread through us. Double quotes hello. Max called out, his voice cracking. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. We took a step closer, the tension thick in the air. That's when the creature turned. Its face was hollow, its eyes wide and unblinking, black pits that seemed to suck in the light. A grin stretched across its face, impossibly wide, showing teeth that weren't just sharp, they were jagged, like they had been ripped from something not human. My stomach lurched. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Without warning, the thing opened its mouth and screamed again, this time so close it felt like it was inside my head. The scream was so loud, so pure in its terror, that it sent us stumbling backward. We turned and ran without looking back. The next few minutes were a blur of movement, fear, and adrenaline. We finally reached the camp, all of us panting, shaking, and covered in dirt. We didn't stop to think. We just threw ourselves into the tents, locking everything up as quickly as we could. The fire had burned low, the shadows growing longer and more ominous by the second. We huddled together, our breaths shallow, but the forest was silent again. Not a single sound. It wasn't until hours later, as we sat in our tents trying to recover from the shock, that I noticed something strange. Max had the map in his hands, staring at it with a puzzled look on his face. I leaned over, trying to see what he was looking at. There, on the map, was our campsite, but it was marked with an X, a circle around it, and a single word scrawled next to it. Dead. The air grew even colder. I could feel the blood drain from my face. The map had been in Max's backpack the entire time. We hadn't touched it since we set up camp. It shouldn't have been marked like that. We weren't alone. Not just in the forest. Somewhere, out there, In the trees there was something else, something that had been waiting. We decided to go camping in the woods, a group of 4 of us, looking for an escape from the noise of the city. We'd set up our tents by a stream and spent the day hiking, laughing, and swimming. The kind of carefree joy that only comes with the silence of nature. But that night, everything changed. As the sun set, we built a campfire and roasted marshmallows. The air was still, the kind of stillness that feels unnatural. As the fire crackled, we heard something soft, almost too soft to notice, a rustling from the direction of the trees. We paused, and for a moment, everything felt off. "Did you hear that?" Jake asked, his voice low. I nodded. We all listened, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. It was then that we saw it, a figure, barely visible against the darkness of the forest. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, a shadow moving in the distance, but the shape didn't move like a human. It was too fluid, too wrong. "Probably a deer," I said, trying to laugh it off. But none of us seemed convinced. We stayed by the fire for a while longer, talking to mask the unease. But the wrestling didn't stop. It circled us, getting closer each time, as if whatever was out there was getting braver. Finally, we decided to go to bed, each of us retreating to our separate tents. But sleep didn't come easy. I was lying in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of my tent, when I heard it. A whisper, so faint I almost thought I imagined it. It came from outside, just beyond the thin fabric of my tent. "Help me!" My blood ran cold. I froze, listening for more. Nothing. Was it a voice? Or the wind? I cautiously unzipped my tent, peeking out into the dark. There was nothing. No one. I was about to zip it back up when I saw something. Not a person, but a shape, barely visible under the cover of night. It was moving slowly, crawling on all 4s toward our campsite. My heart hammered in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Should I wake the others? What if it was dangerous? I quickly zipped the tent shut and lay there, my breath shallow, until I heard a soft tap against the canvas. My stomach dropped. It wasn't the whine. Tap. The sound came again, followed by a low growl. I held my breath. The growling was coming from just outside my tent. I was frozen, terrified to make a sound. What was it? It didn't sound like an animal, more like a person, but distorted. I grabbed my phone, trying to turn on the flashlight, but it wouldn't work. The screen flickered, then went black. Panic set in. I had to get out of there. I slowly unzipped the tent, keeping as quiet as I could. The moonlight barely illuminated the clearing, but I could still see the dark shape just a few feet away from me. It was kneeling, its body trembling in a way that was unnatural. Its head snapped toward me. I gasped and slammed the tent flap shut, my heart racing. But then I heard something else. The voice again. But now, it wasn't just one whisper. It was multiple voices, all speaking at once. "Help us, please, they're coming." I grabbed my flashlight, my hands shaking. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. I had to get out. I tried to wake Jake and the others, but none of them were answering. The voices grew louder, and the ground beneath my tent began to tremble as if something huge was moving underneath. And then it hit me. Everything I had thought was a whisper, a rustle, a figure in the dark wasn't outside. It was inside. It wasn't a monster from the woods. It was us, trapped, confused. The whispers weren't coming from outside the tent. They were coming from inside the fabric. I scrambled to unzip my tent, not knowing what I would find. The others were awake now, panicking too, looking around, their faces pale with fear. We stumbled out of our tents, our eyes darting around. We were no longer in the forest. The trees had vanished, and we stood in the middle of a dark, empty field. The sky above us was black and oppressive, the stars dim. Something snapped behind us, a loud crack of dry wood. We turned around and saw what I can only describe as a mass of dark, tangled branches, creeping toward us like fingers from the ground. Then the voices returned, clearer now, but they weren't speaking to us anymore. They were speaking through us. In my mind, in my body, we never leave. The branches reached out, brushing against our legs. It felt cold, sharp, like something dead. The ground started to shake again, and for a brief second, I thought we were back at the campsite. But I turned and saw the fire still burning, far off in the distance. Then, the voices stopped. We were alone, back in the forest. We'd set up camp by a quiet lake, surrounded by trees that stretched up like towering giants. We were far enough from any civilization that it felt like we were in our own little world. We had the usual setup, a campfire crackling in the center, tents scattered around, and the smell of roasting marshmallows filling the air. The night had fallen swiftly, and we were all sitting around the fire, laughing and talking. The moon hung high, casting long shadows over the forest. It was peaceful, almost a peaceful dot. Then, without warning, the silence broke. It wasn't the usual rustling of wind or the chirping of crickets. This was something else. A strange noise echoed from deeper in the forest. At first, we all looked at each other, trying to place it. It sounded like someone was dragging something heavy across the ground. It came in short bursts, then stopped, only to start again, this time closer. I stood up, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. My friends noticed it too. One of them, Jake, grabbed a flashlight and pointed it into the trees, but we saw nothing. The dragging sound continued, but now it was getting more erratic, more frantic. It sounded like whatever was out there was in a hurry. Maybe it's an animal, one of my friends suggested, but I could tell from the way he said it that he didn't believe it. No animal moves like that. The air seemed to grow colder. The fire crackled and popped, but it didn't provide much warmth against the chill that had set in. We all huddled closer, unsure of what to do. Then the sound stopped, as abruptly as it had started. There was only silence now, but it felt thick, heavy, like something was waiting just outside the edge of the firelight. We tried to brush it off and return to our seats, though none of us could truly relax. Then, another noise cut through the quiet, closer this time. The same dragging sound, followed by what could only be described as a low, guttural moan. It sent a shiver down my spine. Jake, clearly on edge, stood up again, shining the flashlight towards the woods. We all held our breath. The beam of light moved across the dark trees, illuminating nothing. But just as Jake was about to lower the light, something caught his eye. At the edge of the trees, there was a figure standing. A tall, thin silhouette, almost blending with the shadows, except for the faint, eerie gleam of eyes that shone back at us. "Who's there?" Jake called out, his voice shaking. No answer. The figure didn't move, but I swore I could feel its presence pressing in on us, like it was waiting for something. The air felt thick, like it was charged with static. We all stood, frozen in place, not daring to make a move. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared back into the woods. No movement, no sound, just gone. We stood in silence, processing what we'd just seen. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be out there. We were deep in the woods, miles from any help. What if we were being watched? What if something, or someone was waiting for the right moment to strike? But after a long pause, Jake finally spoke. "I think we should head back to the car. Now." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order, and we all agreed without a word. But when we started to pack up our things, that's when the real horror began. We hadn't noticed it before, but there were footprints around our camp. Not animal tracks, but human ones. They were fresh, the kind that would only appear in the soft dirt after a rain. And they circled our camp, getting closer with each round. That's when we all heard it. The sound of something heavy dragging along the ground, this time directly behind us. My heart raced. We turned around, and for the briefest moment, we saw it. A pale, gaunt face peering out from behind a tree, its eyes locked on us. But when we blinked, it was gone. We didn't hesitate anymore. We grabbed our gear and ran, adrenaline coursing through our veins. The dragging sound followed us, growing louder, like whatever was chasing us was just a step behind. We didn't stop until we reached the car, but as I sat there, trying to calm my breath, something gnawed at me. We had been so focused on what was chasing us, so terrified of what we had seen in the woods, we didn't realize that the thing we had been running from was already inside the car. I turned to look in the back seat, where I had left my bag earlier. But it wasn't just my bag that was there. There, in the reflection of the window, was the same pale face we'd seen in the woods, its eyes wide and staring directly at me. I'll never forget the smile that spread across its face, just as the car door clicked shut behind me. I've always loved camping. There's something about the crisp air, the sound of rustling trees, and the crackle of a campfire that makes everything feel right. So, when my friends and I decided to spend the weekend out in the wilderness, I thought it would be just another fun, relaxing trip. We'd set up camp by a small creek, surrounded by dense trees and a clear, star-filled sky. Little did we know that this trip would be anything but relaxing. It started out like any other camping weekend. We pitched our tents, unpacked the gear, and made a fire. We joked and laughed as we roasted marshmallows, telling stories and enjoying the peace of the forest. But when night fell and the stars filled the sky, something shifted. The air grew colder, and the once comforting sounds of the forest became unnervingly silent. Even the crackling of the fire seemed to fade into a muffled hum. I was the first to notice the footsteps. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the wind, the rustling of branches or small animals scurrying about. But the footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate. Slow, rhythmic steps circled the camp. I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me. The others didn't seem to hear anything, and we were all too tired to care. But the sound grew louder, more pronounced, and it wasn't just circling anymore, it was getting closer. I excused myself to the edge of the campsite, pretending to go to the bathroom, but really just needing some space to listen. The footsteps stopped as soon as I stepped away from the fire, leaving me in a thick silence. Then, from the trees beyond the camp, I heard a low growl. Not an animal growl, something deeper, almost human, but wrong in every sense. My heart began to race. I walked quickly back to the fire, but as soon as I crossed the threshold of the camp, the growling stopped, replaced by a soft voice calling my name. It was so quiet, I almost couldn't hear it, but there was something distinctly familiar about it. It was my voice, only it wasn't me. It sounded like a distorted, twisted version of me, echoing from the woods behind the campsite. I sat back down next to my friends, trying to act normal, though my mind was reeling. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The others continued to laugh, oblivious, as if nothing was out of place. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The night dragged on, and I kept my eyes on the trees, expecting anything to happen. Finally, when we decided to call it a night and retreat to our tents, I heard a sharp snap of a branch behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The camp was still. I crawled into my tent, unable to sleep. Every rustle of the trees, every creak of the wood outside made my skin crawl. I tried to close my eyes, but that's when I heard it again, a voice, calling my name. This time, it was right outside my tent. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't my voice this time. It was someone else's, a whisper full of malice and hunger. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. I held my breath, hoping the sound would go away. It didn't. The whisper grew louder, clearer, and then I heard a low, unsettling chuckle that sent ice through my veins. I scrambled to unzip the tent, bursting out into the night air. But as I stood up, I saw something that froze me in place. My friends were standing near the fire, all of them staring into the woods with wide eyes. But they weren't looking at anything, they were staring at themselves. Their own faces, standing in the shadows, identical to the ones in front of me. There were more of them, twice as many as there should have been. I stumbled backward, horrified. The faces in the shadows moved, stepping forward, but the real versions of my friends stayed still, their eyes locked on the duplicates. I turned to them, my voice shaking as I asked, "What's going on? Who are they?" One of the figures in the shadows, the one that looked like me, smiled. It was a smile that was not mine, a twisted grin that sent a surge of terror through me. Then, the voice whispered again, only this time it wasn't calling my name. It was laughing. In that moment, I realized the horrifying truth. The forest wasn't just watching us, it had been waiting for us. And now it had us all. The copies of us weren't just standing there. They were waiting for us to make the first move. They wanted us to break the silence, to show fear. But we didn't. We stood our ground, our real selves frozen in place, facing our monstrous doubles, staring into the night. And then, as if on cue, the air shifted. The footsteps returned, and from the darkness, a figure stepped forward, tall, thin, and dressed in tattered clothes, its face hidden behind a mask of old bark. It was time. The forest had claimed us. Setting up camp was easy. Tents, fire pit, and a cooler full of food and drinks. We were ready to relax, tell stories, and laugh the night away. We had no idea that the night would hold something much darker than any of us could have anticipated. By the time darkness settled in, the forest was eerily quiet. The usual sounds of animals were absent, and the only noises came from the crackling fire and the occasional rustling of branches in the wind. We sat around the fire, the three of us joking and swapping ghost stories. I tried not to let the silence in the woods unnerve me, but it was hard to ignore. As the hours passed, I felt a coldness creeping in. Not the kind you get from the night air, but a deep, unsettling chill that wrapped around my spine and made my skin prickle. I glanced over at my friends. They were laughing, but I could see the unease in their eyes too, though neither of them said anything. Then we heard it, a rustling, like something moving through the bushes just beyond the firelight. At first, we all brushed it off, blaming the wind, but it happened again. A low, almost human-like groan, followed by the snap of a twig. My heart raced. It was too distinct to be an animal, and too strange to be the wind. I stood up, my legs shaking, and stared into the darkness where the noise had come from. I could barely make out the shapes of trees, the shadows of the underbrush. My friends noticed my sudden tension, and stood up too. We huddled together near the fire. Probably just a deer, one of my friends suggested, but I didn't believe that for a second. The sound had been wrong. I turned toward the forest, trying to spot any movement, when the rustling grew louder, and then something emerged from the shadows, a figure, tall and thin, stepping out from between the trees. The firelight barely touched its features, but I could make out the shape of it. It was humanoid, but not quite right. The figure didn't move like a person, more like a marionette with strings pulled by someone who didn't know what they were doing. My breath caught in my throat. My friends were frozen, not speaking. The thing didn't seem to notice us right away, or maybe it did and just didn't care. But then it slowly turned its head toward us, and I could see the faintest glimmer of what looked like eyes, except they weren't eyes. They were dark, empty voids. My heart was hammering in my chest as the thing took another step forward. It was impossibly tall, its limbs unnaturally long, its joints bending in strange angles. The air grew heavier, as if something was pressing in on us from all sides. We all backed up instinctively, but the creature just stood there, swaying slightly, its head tilting as though it was studying us. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking, and fumbled for the flashlight. I shone the light directly at the figure, but it didn't flinch. The beam of light barely touched it. As I clicked the button to turn the light off, a loud bang echoed from the woods behind us. We spun around, hearts in our throats. Nothing. Then, suddenly, the creature darted toward us faster than anything should have been able to move through the thick underbrush. My friends screamed, and we bolted for the tents, running faster than we ever thought we could. We didn't stop until we were all huddled inside the tents, breathless and terrified. We lay there in silence, listening. Nothing. No movement. No more groans or wrestling. Just the sound of our heavy breathing. Then I heard it. A whisper, low and guttural, right outside the tent. It wasn't one of my friends. It was too far away, too foreign, but it was close enough that I could hear it clearly. The voice wasn't saying words, only sounds, distorted, like something trying to mimic human speech. I crawled out of my sleeping bag and slowly unzipped the tent door, just enough to peek outside. There was nothing there. But then I looked up at the trees, and there, high in the branches, hanging upside down, was the creature staring directly at me with those empty black voids for eyes. That's when I realized what had been wrong. The creature wasn't the thing that had been moving through the woods. It had been mimicking the sounds of the forest, making it seem like nothing unusual was happening, all while it watched us from a distance, learning how we reacted, how we moved. It had been there all along. It wasn't just hunting us, it was studying us. And it knew we had no escape. It stayed there for hours, watching us from the treetops. Eventually, the fear faded enough that we all managed to sleep, though none of us would talk about what had happened until the next morning. By then, we packed up and left quickly. We made it home safe. But I can never shake the feeling that we weren't alone when we were in those woods. And I wonder, sometimes, if it's still watching me. It was a group of us, 5 friends from college, seeking a weekend of escape in the remote wilderness. None of us had ever camped in a place like this, far off the usual trails. Our phones had no signal, which only added to the appeal. The kind of place where you could unplug and truly be free. We had chosen a clearing by a small creek, surrounded by towering pines. The fire pit was already there, an old circle of stones, blackened by years of use. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the quiet was profound, like the world had forgotten us. As night fell, we settled around the campfire, cracking jokes and drinking beers. The flames danced and cracked, casting long, flickering shadows. I noticed it was unusually quiet, even for the woods. No owls hooting, no rustling of small animals in the brush. Just the fire and the sound of the creek. It didn't seem right, but I shrugged it off. By around midnight, we were all in our tents. I was sharing with 2 others, and the others were spread out nearby. It wasn't cold yet, but the dampness in the air seeped in, making the inside of the tent feel heavier than it should. That's when I heard it. A faint scratching sound, like something lightly tapping against the canvas of our tent. I held my breath, trying to place it. Maybe it was an animal, a raccoon or a squirrel, but the scratching grew louder, more deliberate. I turned to my friends, but neither of them seemed to hear it. I glanced out the tiny window flap, but there was nothing, just blackness. I convinced myself it was just the wind. We were deep in the woods, after all, but then it came again, louder this time. A tap, 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 right near my ear. My heart thudded in my chest. I reached for the flashlight, shining it at the spot where the sound was coming from. Nothing. I wanted to call out to the others, but I didn't want to sound paranoid. I tried to lie still, hoping it would stop. But instead, the sound grew in intensity, as if whatever it was moving around the tent, circling it, tapping at every corner. My friends still didn't stir, and I wasn't sure if I should wake them up. I grabbed my pocket knife, feeling ridiculous, but protective, and I decided to step out and check the perimeter. The moment my foot touched the cold ground outside, the scratching stopped. A sudden, unnatural silence settled in. I scanned the trees. There was nothing, just the faint outline of the forest beyond the fire's glow. No eyes, no movement. I walked a few paces away from the tent, my flashlight casting long shadows. The silence was unbearable now. Every crackling branch, every gust of wind, made me jump. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe an animal had gotten too curious, but as I turned to head back, something caught my eye in the distance. Near the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the trees, was a figure. It was too far to make out clearly, but it stood still, staring in our direction. I froze. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. I didn't wait. I rushed back to the tent, my heart racing. I woke my friends, and they looked at me with confusion, asking what was wrong. I tried to explain, but they dismissed it, laughing it off as an overactive imagination. Maybe it was just another camper passing through, but I knew what I had seen. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Something was out there. We sat around the fire for a while, talking about the strange feeling in the air, but eventually, we settled back into the tents. The sound of the creek, the rustling of leaves, everything felt wrong now. I didn't sleep much, half expecting that scratching to return, half hoping it wouldn't. Then, at 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of something far worse than scratching. It was a voice, whispering my name. I jerked upright, heart pounding. The voice was soft but clear, coming from the far side of the camp. I looked at my friends, but they were still asleep, breathing steadily. The beam landed on something that made my blood run cold. A figure standing in the firelight, dressed in rags, with eyes wide open and unblinking, staring straight at me. But the most chilling part was that the figure was holding a flashlight. My flashlight. I turned back to the camp. My friends were still asleep. I don't know how I got back to the tent, but somehow, I managed to crawl in and zip it shut. My hands shook as I held the flashlight, my mind racing. That thing, whoever it was, had been watching us, mimicking me. We packed up and left at first light. As we drove away, I glanced back at the clearing, now bathed in the early morning light. I didn't see anyone, but I'll never forget the sound of my voice, whispering from the woods. We had been planning the camping trip for weeks. There were 6 of us, 2 couples, and my best friend Mike. We all piled into a small van with tents, sleeping bags, and gear. It was early autumn, and the woods were stunning, full of vibrant colors, crisp air, and that perfect silence you only find miles from civilization. The drive was long, but we finally reached the spot. The forest was dense, the trees thick with the weight of the season. The ground was soft beneath our boots as we set up camp in a clearing near a small creek. We were far enough away from other campsites that it felt private, isolated. Perfect. After an easy dinner of hot dogs and marshmallows, we settled by the fire. The crackling wood warming our faces. It started around midnight. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling the leaves. Then I realized the sound was too rhythmic, almost like footsteps, soft but deliberate. The others didn't seem to notice. They were lost in conversation, laughing about something dumb Mike had said. But the footsteps grew louder, too close. I stood up, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. The forest was too still, the firelight too dim. "Guys," I said, my voice shaking a bit, "did you hear that?" Everyone stopped talking. There was only silence for a moment, then a twig snapped from the woods just beyond the firelight. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced over at Mike, whose face was suddenly tight with tension. He was always the skeptic, the one who dismissed my fears. "Probably a deer or something," he muttered, but he didn't sound so sure. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We sat in tense silence, the fire flickering and the darkness pressing in around us. After a while, the footsteps stopped. The tension hung in the air like a fog. We laughed it off, but I could still feel that someone, or something, was out there. Around 2 a.m., we decided to turn in. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, and the fire was dying down. I settled into my tent, trying to push aside the unease. Mike was already snoring in his tent across from mine. The others were quiet, but I couldn't fall asleep. My mind kept replaying the sounds I'd heard. That rhythmic, deliberate step. It had sounded to human. I heard it again, just as I was starting to drift off. A soft step, then another, and then crunch. A heavy footfall much closer this time. My heart slammed in my chest. I grabbed the flashlight, hesitating, then unzipped the tent and stuck my head out. There was nothing, only the dark outline of trees. The creek, trickling in the distance. I stepped out, the cold air biting at my skin. The ground felt unnervingly soft under my boots as I walked toward the tree line, flashlight in hand. Then I saw a figure in the distance, just beyond the edge of the firelight, a shadow, standing still. "Hey," I called, my voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't move. I swallowed hard and stepped forward, my legs shaking. The light from my flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the trunks of the trees. "Hello," I called again. A rustling came from the bushes beside me. My heart raced as I turned toward it, but before I could react, something gripped my arm. I whipped around, flashlight catching Mike standing there. He looked terrified. "Don't," he said, his voice low and urgent. "It's not a person." "What?" I asked, confusion washing over me. "Just get back to the fire. Now." I pulled away from his grip, still unsure, but his face was pale and shaking. We turned and hurried back to the camp, not daring to look behind us. As we reached the fire, the others were standing up, looking nervous. Mike yanked his tent shut and grabbed his knife. "I don't know what's out there," he said, eyes wide. "But it's not a person." We sat in silence, the fire casting long, ghostly shadows on the trees. The night dragged on, each of us listening intently to the woods around us, but nothing happened. We stayed up, taking turns on watch, the hours ticking by. It wasn't until dawn that we finally let ourselves relax. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. By late afternoon, we packed up our camp, ready to leave. As we were gathering our things, I found something odd. One of our tents, the one closest to the tree line, had been slashed open along the side. No one had touched it, and we had all been accounted for the whole time. But what was even stranger was what I found lying on the ground near the terrace mall, withered notebook. I flipped it open. The pages were filled with strange, almost frantic writing, notes about the woods, sketches of trees, and at the very end, a single sentence: "You never leave, not if they want you to stay." My blood ran cold. We weren't alone in those woods, but the thing that really chilled me to the core, the writing was in Mike's handwriting. We were excited for our weekend camping trip. the four of us eager to escape the grind of everyday life. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, we arrived at our chosen spot. The site was remote, surrounded by dense woods that promised solitude and adventure. We set up our tents, made a campfire, and cooked hot dogs while sharing stories of past trips, laughing under the stars. As night enveloped the forest, a chill set in. We huddled closer to the fire, and Yano, always the jokester, suggested we play a game. She proposed truth or scare, a twist on the classic game. Each person had to tell a scary story or share a truth that no one else knew. It was all in good fun until it was my turn, with the fire crackling and shadows dancing around us. I began to tell the tale of a local legend, an old park ranger who vanished in the woods decades ago. They say he was searching for something he never found, and on moonless nights, you can still hear his chains rattling as he roams, looking for anyone who dares to camp in his territory. As I spoke, I noticed a flicker of unease in my friend's eyes, but I brushed it off, attributing it to the spooky atmosphere. After my story, we decided to take a short hike before bed. The darkness pressed in around us, the trees towering like silent sentinels. We laughed nervously, trying to keep the mood light, but the deeper we ventured into the woods, the more the sounds of nature seemed to fade. It was eerily quiet, and I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. Suddenly, from somewhere in the darkness, we heard a distinct clanking sound, like metal against metal. My heart raced as we stopped in our tracks, exchanging worried glances. It echoed through the trees, louder now, like chains being dragged across the ground. Gina's face turned pale, and I could see her grip tightening around the flashlight she held. "Let's get back to camp," I suggested, trying to sound calm. We turned to retrace our steps, but the clanking grew louder, more frantic. Panic surged through us, and we broke into a sprint, the beam of our flashlights bobbing erratically as we stumbled through the underbrush. I could hear my friends gasping behind me, their breaths coming in quick bursts. Then we saw lights, flickering in the distance, moving slowly toward us through the trees. They were lanterns, glowing eerily in the dark. My instinct screamed to run, but curiosity held me in place for a moment too long. I wanted to see what was coming. The lanterns approached, revealing figures shrouded in shadows, their faces obscured by dark hoods. "Hide," I shouted, and we dove into the nearest thicket, hearts pounding in our chests. We crouched low, the clanking chains now deafening. Through the gaps in the bushes, we watched as the figures moved closer, each one carrying a lantern that illuminated their strange, unnatural movements. I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back. They walked in a slow, deliberate line, each step synchronized, and I could see that they were bound together by chains. My blood ran cold as the realization hit me these weren't just people. They looked like some kind of ghostly procession. As they passed, I caught a glimpse of their faces, hidden behind the hoods but pale and sunken, as if they had emerged from a grave. Then, suddenly, they stopped. One of them turned, their lantern light sweeping across the bushes where we hid. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if sensing our presence, and then continued on, the group moving as one again. We waited, terrified and breathless, until the sounds faded into the distance. When we finally emerged from our hiding place, dawn was breaking, casting a pale light through the trees. We hurried back to camp, shaken but relieved to find our tents untouched. But as we approached, a chilling sight awaited us. The fire pit was cold, the ashes scattered, and next to it, scratched into the dirt, were the words "You should have stayed" hidden. In that moment, a wave of terror washed over us. We packed our things in silence, hearts racing, and bolted for the car, vowing never to return. As we drove away, I glanced back at the woods, and for a brief second, I could have sworn I saw the same figures standing among the trees, their lanterns flickering like dying stars. The place we chose was remote, nestled deep in a forest where the only sound at night was the occasional hoot of an owl. The kind of place where you could get lost for days if you weren't careful. We set up camp just as the sun was dipping behind the trees, the glow of dusk filtering through the dense canopy. No one had ever been there before, but it was the perfect spot, quiet, peaceful, and far from the prying eyes of the world. Around the campfire, we joked, told stories, and roasted marshmallows. our laughter echoing off the trees. As darkness settled in, the forest around us grew still, and the cold night air made the fire feel even warmer. We were just beginning to relax when it happened. It started as a low rustling sound from the trees, too rhythmic to be an animal. We all stopped talking, staring into the shadows, trying to figure out what it was. The sound grew louder, and then, through the trees, came a soft whisper. At first, it was impossible to make out, but it seemed like it was calling our names. Faint but distinct. It felt wrong. Like something was waiting just beyond the firelight, watching us, knowing us. We all looked at each other, confused and uneasy. Probably just the wind, someone muttered, but even they sounded uncertain. We decided to go for a quick walk to stretch our legs and get some space from the unnerving whispers. The trees felt closer now, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers reaching out to trap us. I tried to shake off the feeling that something was wrong, but the more I walked, the stronger that sensation grew. My skin prickled, and my heart rate quickened. It felt as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. Then we heard it clearer this time, unmistakable. Help. The voice was faint, like it was coming from far away. We stopped dead in our tracks, listening. The air was thick, and even though we couldn't see anything in the dark, we could all feel the presence. It was so real that I swore I could almost taste the fear in the air. The voice came again, and this time it was closer. Help me, please. We didn't know what to do. There was no one else out here. It was just us. But the voice was unmistakable, and against every ounce of common sense, we started following it, moving deeper into the forest. As we walked, the whispers got louder, more desperate, and that feeling of being watched grew unbearable. It was as if the trees themselves were closing in on us, their shadows shifting and flickering in the dim light. After what felt like hours, we stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center of it, lying on the ground, was a figure, a man. He was dressed in tattered clothes, his body stiff, and his face obscured by long, matted hair. For a moment, we stood there, frozen in disbelief. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge us. The whispers were now deafening, echoing all around us. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest as I stepped closer, the others following behind me. I reached out to touch his shoulder, and as my fingers brushed against him, his head snapped around, eyes wide open and black as coal. His lips curled into a grotesque smile, and before I could pull back, he hissed in a voice that was no longer human, "You shouldn't have come." I stumbled backward, my breath caught in my throat. The others were already running, not looking back, but I was paralyzed with fear. I didn't know what to do, where to go, or what the hell had just happened. Then, I felt a tug on my sleeve. I whipped around, expecting to see the figure again, but instead, it was one of my friends, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. "We need to get out of here," he said. Voice shaking, we bolted back toward the camp, the forest seeming to stretch and warp around us, twisting the path like a maze. The whispers followed, growing louder, echoing in my head. As we reached the camp, I expected to find safety, but the fire was out. The tents had been torn apart. The place was a wreck, and that's when I saw the thing that made my blood run cold. Across the campfire's charred remains, written in the dirt, was one simple message: you were never meant to leave. It wasn't the forest we had gotten lost in. It was something far worse, something older, something that had been waiting for us to step into its domain. The woods didn't just hold the memories of the past, they held something far darker. And now, we knew the truth, the voice, the whispers. They were never meant to guide us out. They were meant to keep us there, trapped forever, but we had escaped, at least for now. And as we hurried back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. Because, as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I swear I saw the figure standing by the side of the road, watching us drive away. I never thought camping in the wilderness would be anything but peaceful. My friends and I had planned it for months, picking a remote spot deep in the woods far from the noise of civilization. We were seasoned campers, ready to embrace the quiet solitude of nature. Or so we thought. We arrived late in the afternoon and set up camp, a small fire crackling as dusk began to settle. The forest around us seemed alive, every rustling leaf and snapping twig hinting at something just out of sight. But we laughed it off, sitting around the fire, sharing stories, and roasting marshmallows. By the time the fire was dying down and the shadows grew long, the full moon cast an eerie glow on the trees. It was then that I first felt a faint unease, something creeping at the back of my mind, but I shrugged it away. We were safe. We were all together. As the night grew colder, I noticed how unusually quiet the forest had become. No crickets, no owls, no distant calls of animals. It was as if the entire world had frozen. I glanced around at my friends, each of them staring into the fire, their faces lit with an orange glow. Suddenly, a snap of a twig broke the silence. Sharp and sudden, we all froze. It was too distinct, too deliberate to be an animal. I stood up slowly, trying to peer into the darkness beyond our camp. Nothing, just trees, swaying lightly in the wind. I told myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Trying to shake off the paranoia, I went to fetch more wood from the pile we had gathered earlier. As I turned my back to the fire, I heard a soft rustling sound behind me. I spun around, my heart racing. The fire crackled, and for a brief moment, the world was bathed in light, but there was no one there. My friends hadn't moved, still fixated on the fire. I frowned, convinced it was the wind or my imagination, but then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something moving in the woods. A figure, barely visible in the darkness, just beyond the reach of the firelight. It was tall, thin, and hunched. My stomach dropped. I stepped back toward the camp, my eyes never leaving the shadow. "Did you guys see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. They all looked at me, confused. "See what?" One of them replied. I shook my head. Maybe it was just my nerves. "Nothing. Never mind." I stayed by the fire, but I couldn't stop watching the woods. The figure was still there, unmoving, but somehow, I knew it was staring right at me. I wanted to scream, but something told me if I did, I might invite whatever it was to approach. My instinct screamed for us to leave, but I couldn't move. After what felt like hours, the figure finally vanished, blending into the shadows as if it had never been there. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I had seen, but deep down, I knew it wasn't a trick of the light. It was real. Whatever it was still out there. We spent the rest of the night in silence, the fire burning low, our eyes darting nervously around the camp. None of us wanted to speak of what had happened, but we all felt it. The heavy, suffocating presence of something watching us. When morning finally arrived, we were exhausted, but the woods were peaceful again. The birds were singing, and the sun filtered through the trees like it always had. We packed up quickly, eager to leave the woods behind. As we made our way back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being followed. Every sound, every rustling branch, made me jump. When we reached the clearing where we'd parked, I turned for one last look at the forest. That's when I saw it again, just beyond the tree line. The same figure, standing motionless, watching us. But here's the twist: the figure wasn't alone. There were dozens of them, scattered throughout the woods, all standing perfectly still, all watching us. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. As one of them stepped forward. It was then that I realized something far more chilling. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its posture too unnatural. I could feel my blood run cold as it tilted its head slightly, as if studying us. I turned to my friends, but they were already moving, running without a word, all of us scrambling to get to the car. We didn't look back until the engine roared to life, and we were speeding down the road. We made it back home, safe and sound. But to this day, I can't stop thinking about that night. The things we saw in the woods weren't just watching us, they were waiting for something. Waiting for us to make the wrong move, to stray too far, to stumble into their territory. We were lucky to get away when we did. And the scariest part, I've never gone camping again. I've always loved camping. There's something magical about being surrounded by nature. But that love quickly turned into a nightmare one evening in the woods with friends. We set out on a Friday afternoon, excited for a weekend filled with hiking, stories around the fire, and the thrill of the great outdoors. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we settled around the campfire, sharing ghost stories and laughing until the flames flickered low. Just as we finished our last story, my friend Yana suggested we take a nighttime walk. The idea sparked a mix of fear and excitement, especially after our spooky tales. I hesitated but finally agreed. Matt and Aaron, ever the adventurers, quickly jumped on board. We grabbed our flashlights and headed into the dark woods, the beam of light cutting through the thick night air. The woods felt alive. The rustling leaves and occasional snaps of twigs beneath our feet heightened our senses. We wandered deeper, the shadows becoming more oppressive. Then, we heard a faint noise in the distance. It sounded like chains dragging along the ground. We stopped, exchanging nervous glances. I laughed it off, but the sound grew louder, echoing through the trees, sending shivers down my spine. Suddenly, we spotted flickering lights moving through the trees. My heart raced as I felt a primal instinct to run, but Yena urged us to hide behind a nearby bush. We ducked down, breathing heavily as the lights drew nearer. My hands trembled as I clutched my flashlight, its beam wavering in the growing tension. As the figures emerged from the darkness, I felt a chill sweep over me. There were 6 of them, all wearing tattered clothing and pale, expressionless masks. Each held a lantern that illuminated their chained bodies, the metal clanking rhythmically as they moved. I felt frozen, unable to look away from the horrific sight. My mind raced with questions. Who were they? What did they want? They passed us by, marching slowly in a single file. I could see their feet dragging, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. It was like something out of a nightmare, and I struggled to convince myself this was real. My friends were just as paralyzed with fear. The sound of chains rattling filled the air as they continued deeper into the woods, the lanterns flickering like distant stars. Once the figures disappeared, we stumbled back to our campsite, too frightened to speak. Every sound in the forest felt amplified, and we huddled close together, trying to shake off the fear. The night dragged on, each crack of a branch sending us into fits of panic. Sleep was impossible, but as the dawn broke, we finally felt safe enough to check on our camp. As we approached the site, a sense of dread washed over me. Our campsite looked different. The tents were askew, and the fire pit was smoldering. I stepped closer, my heart racing. In the dirt beside the fire, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A message was etched into the ground, clear as day: "We will find you." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The terror from the night before flooded back. I turned to my friends, and their faces mirrored my own fear. We needed to leave. We hurriedly packed our things, our hands trembling as we stuffed sleeping bags and food into our packs. I glanced back at the campsite one last time, and that's when I saw a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, still wearing the mask, illuminated by the morning sun. It didn't move, just stood there watching us with an eerie stillness. I felt a surge of panic and grabbed Gina's arm. We ran to the car, our hearts pounding in unison, and drove off without looking back. It wasn't until we were miles away that we finally allowed ourselves to breathe again. The fear began to ebb, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As we reached the highway, I turned around to look back at the woods one last time. To my horror, there was a row of flickering lanterns in the distance, standing still against the backdrop of the trees. The memory of that night still haunts me. I can never explain what we saw, but I know one thing for sure: the woods hold secrets that should never be disturbed, and some things are better left in the dark. We were deep in the forest, miles from any town or road, camping under a sky smeared with clouds. The air smelled of wet pine and damp earth. The fire crackled in front of us, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway, just me and a couple of friends. No big deal. But by the second night, something had changed. It was around midnight when things started to feel off. The wind had picked up, rustling through the trees, but I noticed something odd. There was no sound from the forest, no chirping of crickets, no rustle of small animals, just silence. We were sitting around the fire, talking and laughing, when we heard it. A soft thud, like something heavy landing on the ground just outside the campsite. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or something large. But then there was another thud, and then another, each one growing closer. My friend Sarah's eyes widened, and she stood up. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied. "Maybe it's just an animal." But it didn't feel like an animal. It didn't sound like the usual forest noises. The thuds were too deliberate, too rhythmic. It wasn't until the fourth thud that I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stood up, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the dark. I moved toward the edge of the clearing, trying to peer into the shadows, but the trees swallowed everything beyond the reach of our firelight. "Stop it. It's probably just a moose or something," I said, my voice shaky. But Sarah was already backing away, her eyes wide with fear. "No, it's not. I think someone's out there." I laughed it off, though I couldn't deny the unease crawling up my spine. Then, just as I was about to call out to my friend Alex, the thud stopped, complete silence again. We stood there, tense and still, listening for anything movement, a voice, a crackle of leaves. But there was nothing. The silence was deafening, and the wind had died down completely. A few moments passed before Alex, trying to lighten the mood, grabbed a flashlight and pointed it into the trees. The beam of light flickered through the darkness, illuminating only the trunks and branches. We all watched nervously, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then the beam of light landed on something in the distance. At first, I thought it was just another tree, but as the light held steady, I realized it wasn't. It was something standing. It was tall, unnaturally so. Its shape was blurry at first, like something distorted in the light. I could make out its outline, a figure hunched forward, something almost human, but not quite. It was hard to say whether it had legs or not. It was like the light didn't want to touch it fully. Alex's voice was barely above a whisper. "What is that?" Sarah gasped, stepping backward into me. I could feel her heart racing. Before I could react, the figure suddenly moved. It wasn't a normal movement. It wasn't human. It was fluid and jerky at once, as though it wasn't used to walking, or maybe it was floating. "Run!" I shouted. We bolted back to the fire, adrenaline making my legs feel like lead. We could hear it, those unmistakable thuds following us, but they were faster now, closer, almost like something large and heavy was running right behind us. I didn't dare look back, not even for a second. We scrambled to our tent, breathless and panicked, trying to lock it as fast as possible. We threw ourselves inside and zipped the door shut, hearts racing. But, as we huddled together in the dark, trying to catch our breath, something strange happened. We heard a soft, unmistakable sound of voice. It was a whisper, so quiet we could barely hear it over the pounding of our own hearts. "Let me in." The voice was faint, distant, but it was clear it was coming from outside the tent. My breath caught in my throat. I knew we were alone. There was no one else out there. "Let me in," it whispered again. This time, I heard it clearer. It wasn't a request. It was a demand. Suddenly, the tent began to shake. It was subtle at first, then harder, as if something was pressing against the fabric, trying to get inside. My friends froze, wide-eyed, as the whisper grew louder, now frantic, desperate. "I'm not alone," it said, the words dripping with cold venom. "I'm never alone. But you will be." The shaking stopped as abruptly as it started, and there was a long, horrible silence. Then, just as quickly, the tent zipper violently jerked open from the outside. I watched in horror as the door pulled back with impossible strength, but there was no one there. When we finally mustered the courage to leave the tent, the fire had gone out. The clearing was empty, the trees stood silent, and the wind had returned. But one thing was unmistakable: the footprints. They were large, leading away from the tent, disappearing into the forest. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks, a chance to escape the noise of the city and unwind in nature with my friends. We picked a remote spot deep in the woods, far from any trails or cabins. Just the four of us, me, Alex, Jenna, and Marcus. We set up our tents and gathered firewood, the atmosphere filled with laughter as the sun dipped below the horizon. As darkness enveloped the camp, we roasted marshmallows and shared stories that ranged from silly to spine-chilling. I felt a warm glow inside as I watched my friends enjoy the night, but it didn't last long. Alex suggested we play a game of truth or dare. I remember feeling a little uneasy about it. Something about the looming trees seemed to echo our laughter, almost mocking it. When it was my turn, I chose truth. I was asked about my biggest fear. I shared that I was terrified of being lost in the woods, alone and unable to find my way back. They laughed it off, but as I looked into the darkened tree line, I felt that familiar chill creep up my spine. After the game, Jenna suggested a night hike. I hesitated but agreed, thinking it would be a fun adventure. We grabbed our flashlights and headed down a narrow path surrounded by thick trees. The moonlight struggled to penetrate the canopy above, casting eerie shadows that danced along the ground. At first, we walked in jovial spirits, joking and laughing. But, as we moved deeper into the woods, the atmosphere shifted. The wind picked up, causing the branches to sway and creak ominously. The sound of rustling leaves became unnaturally loud. I started to feel anxious, and I glanced around, noticing the darkness felt thicker here. Suddenly, we heard a noise, a distant, strange sound like metal scraping against metal. My heart raced. "Did you hear that?" I asked, trying to mask my fear. The others nodded, their faces pale. We decided to follow the sound, driven by a mix of curiosity and fear. As we crept forward, the noise grew louder. It wasn't just one sound, but a symphony of clanging and thudding, echoing through the trees. The lights from our flashlights flickered, and the shadows around us seemed to swirl ominously. I felt an urge to turn back, but the others pushed forward. Finally, we reached a clearing, and the scene before us froze me in place. Several figures were silhouetted against a flickering light, standing in a circle. They wore tattered clothing and strange masks made of bark and leaves. Each held a lantern, illuminating their expressions, which were a mix of excitement and something darker. My stomach churned as I realized they were not just hikers, but a strange, almost cult-like gathering. Before we could process what we were witnessing, one of the figures spotted us. A loud, eerie laughter erupted from the group, sending chills down my spine. Panic set in, and we turned to run, but the path behind us felt altered, the trees closing in as if they were shifting, trapping us. We stumbled through the underbrush, desperately trying to find our way back to camp. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out the laughter that chased us. Just when I thought we were lost forever, we burst through the trees and back into our campsite, breathing heavily, but the camp wasn't how we left it. The fire pit was extinguished, the tents were torn, and our backpacks were scattered. In the center of the campsite was a single lantern, lit and flickering. Scrawled in the dirt around it were the words, "We've been waiting." Fear washed over us as we scrambled to gather our things. I glanced back toward the tree line, half expecting to see the figures watching us. We didn't speak as we packed, but the silence was thick with dread. We drove off in a rush, the night closing in around us. As we hit the road, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see nothing but the empty road behind us. Instead, I saw one of those figures standing at the edge of the woods, holding its lantern high, its face obscured by a mask. The last thing I remember is the figure raising a hand and pointing at me. And then we were gone. To this day, I avoid the woods, and I can never shake the feeling that they are waiting for me to return. It was supposed to be a carefree camping trip, a chance for me and my friends Mark, Lisa, and Jake to escape the daily grind and reconnect with nature. We drove out to a secluded spot in the national forest, far away from the noise of the city. The sun was shining, and we were all in high spirits as we set up our tents and prepared for a weekend of fun. That first night, we built a campfire and roasted marshmallows, telling ghost stories that made us laugh and shiver at the same time. As darkness fell, the shadows deepened, and the woods around us came alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant animal calls. It felt magical until it did around midnight. After the fire had died down to glowing embers, I decided to take a walk. I figured some fresh air would help clear my head. I told my friends I'd be back shortly and ventured a few yards into the trees. The moonlight filtered through the branches, casting eerie shadows that danced along the ground. That's when I heard a faint whispering coming from deeper in the woods. I paused, straining to listen. It was hard to make out the words, but the tone was unsettling, almost pleading. I called out, "Hey, is anyone there?" The whispers stopped abruptly. My heart raced as I turned back toward the campsite, deciding that my curiosity had gotten the better of me. When I returned, I noticed my friends were huddled together, looking uneasy. "What's wrong?" I asked, trying to shake off my own anxiety. "We heard something," Lisa said, her voice trembling. It sounded like someone was calling for help, but then it just stopped. I felt a chill run down my spine. You heard it too? Mark nodded, glancing nervously at the dark trees surrounding us. It's probably just some animal, he said, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. We tried to shake it off, playing cards by the fire. But every time the wind rustled the leaves, we all jumped. The atmosphere grew heavy with tension, and the whispers from earlier nagged at the back of my mind. Just as I thought I might be able to relax, a sudden cold breeze swept through the campsite, extinguishing our fire and plunging us into darkness. We scrambled for our flashlights, our hearts pounding in unison. In the dim glow of our lights, I thought I saw something moving at the edge of the trees, faint shapes flickering in and out of view. Did you see that? Jake whispered, his voice barely above a whisper. Before we could respond, the whispering returned, clearer now. It sounded like multiple voices, overlapping and unintelligible, as if they were trying to communicate something urgent. We stood frozen, unable to move, caught in a web of fear and curiosity. Then, as suddenly as it began, the voices faded, and the fire reignited, casting warm light around us. It was as if the forest had decided to relent, allowing us a brief respite. The air felt thick with unspoken words, and we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Finally, exhausted, we crawled into our tents, vowing to leave at first light. That night, we barely slept, the whispers lingering in our minds. As dawn broke, we packed our things in silence, the weight of our experience heavy on our hearts. We left the campsite without looking back, relieved to drive away from the whispering woods. The experience was unsettling, but we all made it out alive, with a story that would haunt us for years to come. The forest held its secrets close, and we were just fortunate enough to escape without knowing what lurked within. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend in the woods with friends. We had planned this camping trip for weeks, a chance to escape the chaos of daily life. I drove us deep into the forest, the road narrowing until it became a mere trail. The trees towered over us, their leaves whispering secrets in the wind. As we set up camp, the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving an eerie twilight that seemed to cloak the world in mystery. After a hearty dinner, we gathered around the fire, sharing stories and laughter. The flames danced, illuminating our faces and casting long shadows on the trees. My friends, Yena, Matt, and Aaron, were all in high spirits, but I felt a strange unease creeping in. The woods were too quiet, too still, as if they were holding their breath. Yena suggested we go for a night hike. She had a way of always being the bravest among us, and her enthusiasm was infectious. Reluctantly, we agreed, grabbing our flashlights and venturing into the darkness. The beam of light illuminated the narrow path ahead, but the darkness quickly swallowed everything beyond. As we walked, the sounds of the forest seemed to fade, replaced by an oppressive silence that gnawed at the edges of my mind. About a half-mile in, we heard it. A low, rhythmic sound, like something heavy being dragged across the ground. It stopped us in our tracks. My heart raced, and I exchanged nervous glances with my friends. Matt suggested we investigate, and against my better judgment, we moved toward the sound. As we crept through the underbrush, we stumbled upon a clearing. What we saw made my blood run cold. There, in the center, were chains linked to a massive tree stump. The chains were rusted and old, and next to them lay a small lantern flickering weakly. Panic surged through me, but before I could suggest we turn back, we heard a faint whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. We strained to listen, and then we saw them. Figures appeared at the edge of the clearing, cloaked in shadow, moving closer. Their faces were hidden beneath hoods, and they were holding lanterns. A chill ran down my spine as I realized they were dragging chains behind them. The same sound we had heard moments before. We froze, hearts pounding, as they approached the lantern. There were at least 5 of them, silent and ominous, and I could feel a primal urge to run. Yena, however, whispered for us to stay hidden. My instincts screamed for me to flee, but the combination of fear and curiosity rooted me in place. Suddenly, one of the figures turned sharply, shining a lantern in our direction. Light flooded the area, and for a split second, I could see its face, a pale mask, expressionless and hollow. The sight sent me into a panic, and I grabbed Gina's arm, urging her to run. We bolted through the trees, the sound of chains clanking behind us as the figures began to follow. We sprinted back to camp, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. My mind raced with the image of those masked figures, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being hunted. As we reached our campsite, we stopped, looking for signs of life. The fire had gone cold, and the area was eerily quiet, but something was off. Our tents were still standing, yet everything felt wrong. In the center of our campsite, engraved in the ground was a message: "You shouldn't have come here." The letters were crude, as if scratched by something sharp and heavy. Panic surged again, and we scrambled to gather our belongings, adrenaline fueling our movements. Just as we finished packing, we heard the chains again, much closer this time. I glanced toward the tree line and saw the flicker of lanterns. We dashed to the car, fumbling with the keys. Our hearts racing, we jumped inside, slamming the doors as I turned the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I backed out of the campsite. As we sped down the trail, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figures stood at the edge of the woods, their lanterns casting an eerie glow in the darkness. But as I looked closer, my stomach dropped. There was no one there. The figures had vanished, yet the lanterns still flickered ominously. The realization hit me like a cold wave. We weren't running from something in the woods. We had been lured here, and now something had marked us, watching from the darkness. The sense of dread settled in as we drove away, knowing we would never return to those woods again. The summer sun dipped low as we arrived at the campsite, a remote stretch of forest far from the buzz of civilization. I had always found solace in the woods, but something felt different this time. It was just me, Jenna, and Marcus' friends who were eager for a weekend of adventure, away from the constant hum of daily life. We set up our tents as the air cooled, and laughter filled the clearing as we roasted marshmallows by the fire. As darkness enveloped the forest, Jenna suggested we take a night hike. The idea sparked excitement, but I felt a twinge of hesitation. Still, the thrill of exploring the woods at night won out, and soon we were wandering deeper into the trees, flashlights cutting through the blackness. The forest was alive with sounds: crickets chirping, leaves rustling, the occasional hoot of an owl. It wasn't long before we stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin nestled among the trees. The wood was weathered and gray, and the windows were boarded up. Intrigued, we approached cautiously. Marcus, ever the brave one, nudged the door, and to our surprise, it creaked open. A wave of unease washed over me, but my curiosity urged me forward. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. The floor creaked beneath our feet, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Jenna shone her flashlight around the room, illuminating faded photographs on the walls, images of families smiling, their eyes hauntingly empty. A sense of dread settled over me. I wanted to leave, but I stayed, captivated by the strange energy that enveloped the cabin. We explored for a while, but as the shadows grew longer, we decided to head back to camp. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural growl echoed from deep in the woods. I froze, the sound crawling under my skin. It wasn't an animal, it was something else, something menacing. We hurried back to the campsite, the fire crackling warmly as we huddled close. The growling had stopped, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I exchanged glances with Jenna and Marcus, silently acknowledging the unease that hung in the air. As the night wore on, I found it harder to shake the feeling of dread. I suggested we play a game to distract ourselves. We ended up telling ghost stories, our voices hushed as the tales grew darker. At one point, Marcus shared a legend he'd heard about a creature that roamed these woods, a spirit that took the form of a lost traveler, luring people into the forest never to return. Just as he finished, a loud crash echoed from the woods. My heart raced as we all jumped, flashlights flickering nervously in the direction of the sound. We strained to see, but the darkness swallowed everything. Then, suddenly, a figure emerged, illuminated briefly by our lights. It was a man, disheveled and wild-eyed, wearing tattered clothes. He stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at us with an unsettling intensity. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Help me, they're coming for me." We were frozen, the air thick with tension. I looked at Jenna and Marcus, both pale and wide-eyed. The man took a step closer, and in that moment, something shifted in the shadows behind him. More figures appeared, all with the same hollow eyes and tattered clothes. They emerged like wraiths from the darkness, their bodies flickering in and out of the light. Panic surged through me, and without thinking, we scrambled for the safety of the trees, hearts pounding in our chests. We ducked behind a large oak, breathless and terrified, as the figures advanced, their murmurs echoing through the night. I could feel the weight of their gaze, chilling and predatory. Then, just as we thought it couldn't get any worse, I heard a voice whispering my name from the depths of the woods. It sounded just like Jenna. My stomach dropped. The growls returned, closer now, mingling with the whispers. Realizing we were being lured into the forest, I grabbed Jenna's arm and pulled her back. "We have to go," I shouted. We ran blindly, adrenaline fueling our escape, not stopping until we burst into the clearing where our campfire flickered in the darkness. We made it back to the tents, shaking and terrified, convinced we'd escaped whatever haunted those woods. As dawn broke, we packed our belongings in silence, the shadows of the night still looming large in our minds. Just before we left, I glanced back at the cabin. Its presence felt like a dark secret. There was a flash of movement in one of the windows, a face peering out, grinning wide. I blinked, and it was gone. We jumped into the car and drove away, vowing never to return, but the memories of that night would haunt us forever. Little did we know, we weren't the first to escape those woods, and we certainly wouldn't be the last. It was late summer when my friends and I decided to go camping in the woods just outside our town. There were 4 of us, me, Jenna, Mark, and Lucas. We had been looking forward to this trip for weeks, eager to escape our daily routines and enjoy nature. Little did we know that our weekend would take a turn we'd never forget. We set up camp near a beautiful lake surrounded by tall pine trees. The first night was perfect warm weather, clear skies, and a roaring campfire where we shared stories and laughed late into the night. As we sat by the fire, I noticed how quiet the woods were. I expected the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves, but instead, there was an unsettling stillness. Around midnight, we decided to turn in. As I lay in my sleeping bag, I could hear the wind whispering through the trees, but there was something else, a low murmur that seemed to echo through the darkness. It was faint, but it felt as if it was calling to me. I dismissed it as my imagination and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I told the others about the strange sounds. Jenna laughed it off, saying I was just spooked by the dark. But, as we hiked during the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The trees loomed overhead, and every now and then, I thought I saw a shadow dart between them. That night, the air felt different. It was heavy and charged, as if a storm were brewing. We made another fire, but it didn't provide the same warmth as the night before. As we roasted hot dogs, I caught sight of something in the woods just out of the corner of my eye. It was a figure, tall and cloaked, standing still among the trees. I blinked, and it was gone. "Did you see that?" I asked the others, my voice shaky. "What?" Mark replied, looking around. "See what?" "Nothing." "Forget it," I said, trying to brush it off, but I could tell my unease was spreading to them. We finished dinner quickly and decided to play some card games to lighten the mood. As the night wore on, I felt more and more restless. The whispers returned, louder this time, almost like voices. I suggested we go for a walk, hoping to clear my mind. Jenna and Lucas agreed, while Mark stayed back to tend the fire. We wandered along the lake's edge, the moonlight illuminating the water like silver. That's when we heard a clear voice coming from the trees. It was calling my name, softly, almost sweetly. My heart raced, and I glanced at Jenna and Lucas. They heard it too. "Did you hear that?" Jenna whispered, her face pale. We looked at each other, fear creeping in. The voice was beckoning me deeper into the woods. Against my better judgment, I took a step forward, entranced. "Don't," Lucas shouted, grabbing my arm. "We need to go back." The urgency in his voice broke the spell. We turned and hurried back to the campsite, adrenaline pumping. The whispers faded as we approached the fire, and the sense of safety returned, but the unease lingered. That night, we slept fitfully, the shadows outside our tents moving with the wind. When dawn broke, we packed our things in silence, each of us feeling the weight of the night's events. As we drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. We all laughed nervously, but deep down, we knew we'd experienced something inexplicable. The woods had held secrets that night, whispers that would haunt my dreams, reminding me that not everything in nature is friendly. It started out as a typical camping trip with my closest friends. We had all been looking forward to this weekend for months: fresh air, good food, and nights spent telling ghost stories around the fire. There were 6 of us, a tight-knit group, heading out to a secluded spot deep in the woods. It was a place we had visited a few times before, always quiet and peaceful. This time, though, something felt off from the start. The sun had just begun to set when we arrived at our campsite. The trees were dense, the air thick with the smell of pine. We set up our tents and unpacked, laughing as we worked. But there was something unnerving about the silence that surrounded us. No birds, no insects, just a heavy, eerie quiet that made my skin prickle. That night, we built a fire. The flames flickered in the dim light, casting long, dancing shadows on the trees around us. We joked and told stories, but the air felt thick, like something was watching us. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. Just the dark woods stretching out behind our campsite. Around midnight, as the fire began to die down, we heard a noise, something moving through the brush near the edge of our camp. It was faint at first, like footsteps, but quick and deliberate, too deliberate to be an animal. My heart started pounding, but I tried to shake it off. Probably just a deer, I muttered, trying to sound confident, but the footsteps kept coming, closer. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I listened. It was too rhythmic, too precise to be an animal. The others heard it too, and they fell silent. We all turned to look at the edge of the trees where the sound was coming from. For a long, tense moment, nothing moved. Then, just as I was about to suggest we go investigate, a figure appeared at the edge of the fire. It was tall, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. At first, I thought it was just a person, but as it stepped closer, I realized there was something wrong with it. Its skin was pale, almost sickly, and its face was completely blank. No expression, no features. It didn't move like a human, its body jerking unnaturally with each step. Panic surged through me. My friends were frozen, unable to speak, too terrified to even breathe. The figure didn't say a word, just stood there, staring at us. I thought I saw its mouth twitch, but I couldn't be sure. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into the darkness without a sound. We sat there in silence for what felt like hours, none of us daring to speak. Finally, one of us stood up, voice trembling, saying we should pack up and leave. I agreed immediately, and we hastily gathered our things, trying to ignore the feeling of eyes watching us from the trees. We drove through the night, barely speaking, all of us on edge, but the feeling of unease never left. It wasn't until the next day, when we were back in the safety of our homes, that the real horror began. I was checking through the photos we had taken during the trip when I noticed something strange in one of the shots. It was a picture of our campsite, taken before the figure appeared. In the background, just at the edge of the firelight, there was a figure, tall, thin, and just barely visible, blending into the shadows behind the trees. I had no memory of seeing it when the photo was taken. I showed the others, and they all gasped. They remembered the moment clearly. The figure wasn't there when we took the picture, but now it was. We couldn't stop thinking about it. We compared other photos from the trip, but none showed anything unusual. Just the one. The more we discussed it, the more unsettling it became. I decided to zoom in on the figure, and when I did, my stomach dropped. I could see it now, clearer than before. The shape wasn't just standing there, it was looking right at us. Its eyes were dark, empty holes, like someone had carved them out. That's when I realized the most terrifying thing of all. The figure we saw by the fire wasn't the same as the one in the photo. The one we had seen in the photo had been standing there the entire time watching us. The one by the fire had never moved. It was never real. We hadn't been looking at a person at all. We had been looking at a reflection of ourselves, and that figure was still out there. We had planned this camping trip for weeks, our usual way to unwind before winter set in. Yena, Matt, Aaron, and I packed our tents and sleeping bags, and I'd brought a little extra something, a stash of magic mushrooms to enhance the night. We were miles away from any marked trails, deep in the woods where only the sounds of nature kept us company. We set up camp by dusk, got a fire going, and started our little journey with the mushrooms. watching as the trees seemed to breathe and the stars felt close enough to touch. As the fire crackled and shadows danced, Yena suggested we take a walk through the forest. She grinned, saying it'd be creepy, and since we were all a bit out of our minds, it sounded like the perfect idea. We grabbed our flashlights, but something about the inky darkness seemed to swallow the light. Everything felt surreal, as if we'd stumbled into another world. We laughed and whispered as we moved deeper into the trees. But then, from somewhere nearby, a sound broke the stillness. It was faint at first, but unmistakable, the rhythmic clanking of chains. The sound was distant but getting louder, moving closer. We froze, listening as the noise grew. And then, through the trees, a glow appeared, small pinpoints of light, steadily moving in our direction. Panicked, we ducked into the nearest bushes, crouching low as we peered out to see what was coming. My heart hammered in my chest, and every instinct screamed to run, but we were too mesmerized by the sight to move. Emerging through the trees, a procession of figures marched forward, each one draped in chains that rattled with every step. They wore white masks that covered their faces completely, expressionless and pale, giving no clue who or what was behind them. There were at least 10 of them, each holding a lantern that cast an eerie glow across their forms. The orange light flickered, illuminating shackles on their wrists and ankles, the chains connecting them to each other. Their movements were mechanical, precise, as if they'd been marching for centuries without a break. We held our breath, too terrified to even think about making a sound. The figures walked in eerie silence except for the relentless clanking of chains, heading right past our hiding spot. My pulse raced as one of them turned slightly, his mask facing directly toward our bush. The lantern light caught his empty eyes, and I felt a cold, uncheckable dread sink into my bones. I thought I'd been seen, but he turned away and kept walking. They moved onward, disappearing deeper into the woods, their lights fading until only the sound of chains remained. We waited until we were sure they were gone, and then we sat in silence, no one daring to speak. We stumbled back to the campsite in a daze, still reeling from what we'd seen. Sleep was impossible. Every rustle in the dark made us jolt. We stayed huddled together, barely able to close our eyes as we listened to the forest around us, half expecting those figures to return. At the first light of dawn, we decided it was time to go. As we approached the camp, something felt off. From a distance, we could see the tents were knocked over, and the fire we'd put out the night before was smoldering again, as if it had just been lit. We exchanged uneasy glances and moved cautiously toward the site. There, etched in the dirt next to our fire pit, was a message: "We will find you." The words looked fresh, like someone had scratched them in the ground mere moments before we arrived. None of us said a word. We knew what we had to do. We quickly packed what little was left of our things, each of us keeping a nervous eye on the trees, half expecting one of those masked figures to emerge. We practically sprinted back to the car, the weight of an unseen gaze pressing down on us the entire way. It wasn't until we were back on the road, the forest fading behind us, that anyone spoke, and even then, it was in hushed tones. We never went back to those woods, and we never told anyone else what happened. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the clanking of chains echoing in my mind, and I see that mask staring through the darkness. It was a crisp autumn evening when my friends and I decided to go camping deep in the woods, far away from civilization. We were a group of 4: Yena, Matt, Aaron, and me. The trees were ablaze with fall colors, and the air smelled fresh and earthy. We set up our camp near a small clearing, just off a winding path that we had traveled earlier that day. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we gathered around the fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing ghost stories, each one more ridiculous than the last. As the fire flickered, Yena suggested we go for a night hike. The idea sent a thrill through the group, fueled by both the adrenaline of our earlier laughter and the eerie beauty of the forest at night. We grabbed our flashlights and ventured down the dark trail, the shadows of the trees stretching ominously around us. The further we walked, the thicker the darkness became, and I could feel a strange tension in the air, like something was watching us. As we walked deeper into the woods, an unsettling noise broke the silence. It started as a faint rustling, but quickly escalated into a series of loud, clanking sounds. My heart raced, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The noise was accompanied by an odd flickering light that appeared in the distance. It danced like a candle, illuminating the nearby trees. "Do you see that?" Matt whispered, his voice barely audible. We all stopped, squinting into the darkness. The light grew closer, revealing a series of figures in white masks, each carrying a flickering lantern. They seemed to glide along the path, moving with a deliberate slowness that made my skin crawl. I could see chains wrapped around their bodies, clinking together as they moved. Panic surged through us. I instinctively grabbed Gina's arm, pulling her back into the shadows of the trees. We crouched behind a thick bush, our breaths coming in quick gasps. The figures drew closer, and as they passed by, I caught a glimpse of their empty, hollow eyes staring straight ahead. My heart thundered in my chest, a primal instinct telling me to run, but fear held us frozen in place. As they moved out of sight, the air felt heavy with dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were searching for something or someone. We sat in silence, barely daring to breathe, until the last of the figures disappeared into the darkness. After what felt like hours, we finally dared to emerge from our hiding place. Hearts pounding with terror, we decided it was best to return to our camp and pack up. But as we turned back, we were greeted by an even more horrifying sight. Our campsite was in disarray. Tents were ripped open, gear scattered across the ground, and the fire we had built was extinguished, save for a few dying embers. What happened? Aaron stammered, his face pale. But the worst part was what we found etched into the dirt where our fire had been. In crude letters, it read, "We know you're here." My stomach dropped, and I felt a surge of nausea. This wasn't just a prank, it was something far more sinister. Without waiting to grab our belongings, we sprinted back to the car, adrenaline driving us forward. I could hear the distant sounds of chains rattling again, echoing through the trees. Every second felt like an eternity as we stumbled toward our vehicle, fear urging us to move faster. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking as I finally managed to unlock the doors. We piled in, and I slammed the door shut, heart racing. Just as I turned the key in the ignition, a deafening bang echoed outside, as if something had slammed against the car. We screamed, instinctively ducking down as I gunned the engine and tore down the dirt path, leaving the horrors of the woods behind. As we drove further away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. To my horror, I saw the figures standing at the edge of the forest, their lanterns flickering in the darkness, watching us leave. We never spoke of that night again, but even now, I can still hear the distant clank of chains and feel the weight of those hollow eyes fixed upon me. What still haunts me, the realization that they were waiting, not just for us, but for someone else. Someone who had been there before us, and perhaps would be there again. When I was younger, I spent many weekends camping with friends in the woods. This one particular trip was planned to celebrate the end of summer, just before school started. It was me, my cousin Emily, and our two friends, Jake and Sarah. We set up camp in a remote area, far from the busy trails and the noise of the city. The trees were tall and the air smelled of pine, a crispness that reminded us of adventure. After setting up our tents, we gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling ghost stories as dusk turned to night. Sarah had brought her guitar, and we strummed out tunes under a star-filled sky. As the night deepened, I felt a strange energy in the air, almost electric, but I shrugged it off as excitement. As the fire crackled, Emily suggested a night hike. The woods were dark and inviting, and fueled by our earlier stories, we decided to go for it. We grabbed our flashlights and made our way into the forest. The moment we stepped off the clearing, the sounds of the night enveloped us. The chirping of crickets was punctuated by the rustle of leaves, a haunting symphony that was both thrilling and unnerving. We walked for what felt like an hour, chatting and laughing, when suddenly a loud rustling came from the bushes nearby. It sounded almost like a growl. The laughter died instantly, replaced by a heavy silence. We exchanged nervous glances, each of us wondering if we should turn back. Jake, always the brave one, insisted it was probably just a deer. So, we pressed on. As we moved deeper into the woods, we noticed something odd. The trees seemed to close in around us, blocking the moonlight and casting eerie shadows that danced just beyond our line of sight. Then came the sound again. This time it was closer and more pronounced, a scraping noise like nails against wood. My heart raced, but curiosity pushed us forward. Just then, we stumbled into a small clearing, illuminated by our flashlights. There, we found an old, dilapidated cabin, its windows shattered and door hanging off its hinges. It looked abandoned, yet there was a strange feeling that we weren't alone. Despite the unease creeping over us, we approached the cabin, driven by adrenaline and the need for exploration. As we neared the door, I noticed something glimmering in the dirt. I knelt down to inspect it and gasped. It was a small, rusty key. I turned it over in my hand, feeling the weight of its history. My friends gathered around, intrigued. We decided to look inside, the thrill of discovery overshadowing our instincts to leave. With some effort, we pushed the door open, and it creaked loudly, the sound echoing in the night. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. Cobwebs hung in every corner, and the floorboards groaned beneath our feet. As we explored, Sarah suddenly screamed, pointing to the wall. There were strange symbols carved into the wood. Some looked like faces, others like claws reaching out. We stepped back, our hearts racing. Then, without warning, the cabin door slammed shut behind us. We jumped, panic surging as we rushed to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew cold, and a feeling of dread settled in our stomachs. Then, we heard the sound of footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, moving around the cabin. Jake pushed against the door with all his might, and just as it started to budge, the footsteps stopped. We held our breath, the silence almost deafening. We decided to stay quiet, hoping whatever was out there would leave us alone. But then came a low whisper, so soft we could barely hear it. It was unintelligible, but laced with malice, sending chills down my spine. The door rattled as something pressed against it from the outside. Emily, shaking with fear, urged us to find a window. We all scrambled to the nearest one, fumbling with the broken glass, desperate to escape. But before we could get it open, the whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices urging us to listen. Suddenly, the key I had found began to glow in my hand. I glanced at my friends, confusion etched on their faces. Without thinking, I ran back to the door, inserting the key into the lock. To my shock, it turned smoothly, and the door swung open as if inviting us to flee. We stumbled out into the night, gasping for air, the sounds of whispers fading behind us. We ran back to our camp, our hearts pounding, not daring to look back. When we finally reached the safety of the fire, we collapsed in a heap, shaking with adrenaline and fear. But the night was not over. As we settled down, I noticed the key still clutched in my hand. My stomach dropped as I realized the symbols I had seen in the cabin were now etched into my skin, forming a pattern on my wrist that burned like a brand. We were never meant to leave that cabin, and I could feel something watching us from the darkness, waiting for its time. The sun dipped below the horizon as I set up camp with my friends in a secluded area deep in the woods. We'd been looking forward to this trip for months, eager to escape our busy lives for a weekend of hiking and storytelling around the campfire. My friends, Mia, Jake, and Sam, arrived as twilight settled in. The air was crisp and cool, filled with the earthy scent of pine and damp leaves. As darkness fell, we gathered around the fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing ghost stories. Laughter echoed through the trees, drowning out the sounds of the wilderness. But, as the firelight flickered, shadows danced along the edges of our clearing, creating an uneasy feeling I couldn't shake. I brushed it off, attributing my nerves to the stories we were telling. After a while, Mia suggested we explore a nearby trail that wound deeper into the woods. She joked that it would be spooky, which made Jake laugh. Ignoring the gnawing feeling in my stomach, I agreed. After all, we were here for adventure. Armed with flashlights, we set off into the darkness, the beam of light cutting through the thickening night. The deeper we walked, the quieter the forest became. I could feel the tension in the air, and soon, even the crickets fell silent. A strange unease settled over us. I caught Jake glancing nervously into the trees, and Sam kept turning around as if expecting something to follow us. Just when I thought about suggesting we head back, a sudden clatter broke the stillness, a loud crash that echoed through the trees, sending a chill down my spine. What was that? Mia whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Before I could respond, we heard another noise like chains rattling, echoing from somewhere up ahead. We froze, our flashlights illuminating only a small radius of the oppressive darkness. I felt my heart race, pounding in my ears. We exchanged anxious glances, each of us too afraid to speak. Then, I noticed a faint light glowing through the trees ahead, flickering like lanterns. Curiosity mixed with fear compelled us to move closer. As we crept through the underbrush, the sounds grew louder. The clanking of chains and the flickering light became increasingly unnerving. Finally, we reached a clearing, and what we saw will haunt me forever. A group of figures stood in a circle, their backs turned toward us. Each wore tattered clothing and held a lantern that swung slowly in the night. The light illuminated their faces pale and obscured by dirt and grime. My breath caught in my throat as I noticed they were bound in chains, shackled at the wrists and ankles. They swayed slightly, as if caught in a trance, their movements synchronized in an unsettling rhythm. I wanted to scream, but fear paralyzed me. I looked at my friends, their faces reflecting my horror. The group seemed oblivious to our presence, lost in whatever ritual they were performing. I felt a primal urge to run, but I was frozen in place, captivated by the macabre scene unfolding before us. Just as I began to step back, one of the figures turned, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. The mask covering its face was crude, painted with dark streaks that looked like tears. I felt a chill wash over me, and instinct kicked in. We turned to flee, sprinting back the way we came, adrenaline coursing through our veins. The sounds of clanking chains followed us, echoing through the trees. We burst into our campsite, panting and terrified. The fire had died down to embers, casting ghostly shadows around us. We gathered our things, adrenaline still pumping through our bodies. The chilling memory of what we had seen was etched in my mind. But, as we packed in a frenzy, I spotted something on the ground near the fire pit. I knelt down and touched it. It was a rusted chain link, heavy and cold. My heart sank, panic surged through us, and we raced to the car, hearts pounding, desperate to leave the suffocating forest behind. As we drove away, the trees began to blur, the darkness swallowing us whole. I thought we were safe until a flicker of light caught my eye in the rearview mirror. There, in the shadows of the woods, I saw the figures standing still, holding their lanterns, watching us leave. Their haunting presence lingered in the night, a reminder that whatever we had encountered would forever remain in the depths of those woods. The autumn sun had already dipped behind the treetops when I arrived at the remote campsite. I was the only park ranger on duty, and the silence of the forest felt heavy. I had always loved the peace of the woods, but that night, an unsettling feeling crept in like the chill of the evening air. I had just finished my evening rounds when a family of 4 set up camp nearby. They were cheerful and excited, their laughter echoing through the trees. I introduced myself and reminded them to keep food stored properly to avoid any wildlife encounters. They laughed it off, the father joking that they were just going to eat some s'mores anyway. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Later, as darkness enveloped the forest, I started my night shift, equipped with my flashlight and radio. The trees loomed larger, their shadows stretching like fingers across the ground. A gust of wind rustled the leaves, making the night feel alive, as if it were watching. The radio crackled to life, interrupting the eerie quiet. It was the father from the nearby campsite. His voice trembled as he reported strange noises outside their tent. I assured him that it was probably just a deer or a raccoon and that they should stay inside. After I hung up, I couldn't help but glance toward their campsite. The tent was dark, but I could see faint shadows moving inside. A few minutes later, I decided to check on them, wanting to ease their minds. As I walked closer, I heard a loud crash. It sounded like something heavy had fallen nearby. My heart raced. I approached the tent cautiously, shining my flashlight toward the sound. When suddenly I heard the father scream, I ran toward the tent, calling out to the family. The air felt electric, charged with fear. I reached the tent, and the father burst out, eyes wide and panicked. He shouted about something in the woods, something big. Before I could calm him down, I heard it. A low growl, unlike anything had ever encountered, reverberated through the trees. My instincts kicked in, and I ordered the family to stay close to me. We moved cautiously toward the source of the noise, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. The growl echoed again, closer this time, and I felt a chill run down my spine. It was followed by unsettling silence, as if the forest held its breath. Suddenly, something darted between the trees. A glimpse of movement caught my eye. My heart raced as I swung the flashlight in that direction, but it was gone. I turned to the family, urging them to stay quiet and remain alert. Just as I began to feel a sense of control, the ground shook beneath us. A massive figure emerged from the trees, towering and shadowy, its eyes glowing with a menacing light. I froze, my mind racing for an explanation. The father grabbed his children, pulling them back toward me. The creature opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp teeth, and let out a deafening roar. In a panic, I turned to run, dragging the family with me. We sprinted back toward the campsite, my flashlight flickering as the creature pursued us. I could hear its heavy footsteps pounding behind us, each step a reminder that we had to escape. I led them to a clearing, hoping to find safety in the open space. As we reached the clearing, the creature stopped abruptly, as if it had hit an invisible wall. We halted in confusion, panting heavily. The father, breathing heavily, asked why it had stopped. I didn't know. I aimed my flashlight at the creature, and as the beam landed on it, the glow of its eyes flickered out. Suddenly, a blinding light enveloped the clearing, illuminating everything around us. The creature vanished. I blinked, disoriented. The family looked at me, fear still etched on their faces. I assured them we were safe, but deep down, I was shaken. As we made our way back to the campsite, I noticed something strange. The ground was undisturbed, no signs of the chase we had just experienced. We packed up quickly and returned to the park entrance. I glanced back one last time at the woods, where shadows danced in the fading light. I would never forget that night or the creature we never truly saw, and I would never understand what happened in that clearing. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching, lurking just beyond the edge of the forest, waiting for the next unsuspecting visitors. I had been a park ranger for just over a year, and it was a crisp October evening when I found myself on night patrol. The forest was alive with the sounds of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind whispered through the trees. The moon hung low, casting an eerie glow that illuminated the path ahead. I loved this time of year. The air was cool, and the vibrant autumn colors made the woods feel alive. As I rounded a bend, my radio crackled to life. I heard the anxious voice of another ranger. He reported that a group of campers hadn't returned from their hike and were overdue. Concern flooded me as I noted the time. It was getting late, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. I assured him I would head out to look for them. With my flashlight in hand, I set off down the trail. The deeper I ventured into the woods, the more the world around me faded into shadows. I called out to the campers as I walked, hoping to hear a response, but the only reply was the haunting echo of my own voice. Suddenly, I heard something in the distance: laughter. It sounded like it was coming from deeper in the forest. I quickened my pace, the sound of laughter growing louder as I moved closer. As I approached, I noticed something odd. The laughter had taken on an unsettling tone, almost mocking. I broke through the underbrush and stumbled into a clearing. My flashlight beam flickered over several tents set up in a semicircle, but the laughter had ceased. The clearing was empty, and the campers were nowhere to be seen. A chill crept up my spine. It felt as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting. I decided to check the tents. As I unzipped the flap of the first tent, my heart raced. Inside, it was just a mess of sleeping bags and camping gear. No sign of struggle, no indication anyone had been here recently. I moved to the next tent, and when I unzipped it, I was hit by a strange smell, something sweet and putrid. I froze. There was something off about the air. I looked around, feeling a deep sense of unease settle in. I scanned the clearing, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. The trees loomed tall and dark, and I could hear the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. That's when I noticed a dark figure standing at the edge of the woods, partially hidden behind a tree. My pulse quickened, and I gripped my flashlight tighter. I called out, demanding to know who was there. The figure didn't move. I took a hesitant step closer, shining my light toward the figure. As I did, it stepped out from behind the tree, revealing itself. It was a person, but something was horribly wrong. Their limbs were contorted, and their eyes were wide and unblinking. A chill shot through me. This was not a camper. Just then, the laughter erupted again, this time much closer, echoing through the trees. It was a chorus of voices, high-pitched and mocking, like children playing a twisted game. I felt my heart race as the figure began to move toward me. its body swaying unnaturally. I stumbled back, my instinct screaming at me to run. As I turned to flee, I tripped over a root and fell hard to the ground. I scrambled to my feet and bolted back toward the trail, the laughter ringing in my ears. I could hear footsteps behind me, quick and light, as if they were chasing me. I burst out of the woods and onto the main path, gasping for breath. I ran as fast as I could, not daring to look back until I reached the ranger station. When I finally made it, I slammed the door behind me, locking it tight. I collapsed against the wall, trying to steady my racing heart. My radio crackled again, pulling me from my panic. The other ranger's voice cut through, frantic and desperate. He had found the campers huddled together in their tents, but they were terrified and refusing to come out. They had heard the laughter too, but it had stopped as soon as they entered the tents. I felt a chill wash over me. As I relayed what I had seen, I looked out the window into the dark woods. The laughter started again, echoing from the trees, and I realized with horror that the campers had been lured away. Whatever had been in the woods wasn't finished with us yet. The mocking laughter filled the air, and I knew deep down that the forest was hiding more than just shadows. It was alive, and it would not let us go easily. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend camping trip with friends. We chose a remote spot deep in the woods, far from the sounds of the city. The kind of place where you can hear the rustle of leaves and feel the crunch of twigs beneath your feet. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we gathered around the campfire, laughing and telling stories. The air was filled with the smell of roasting marshmallows and the crackling of burning wood. Jenna suggested we go for a night hike to embrace the wilderness. The others were hesitant, but I felt adventurous. The mushrooms we had consumed earlier made everything feel magical, and I wanted to explore. The darkness felt like an invitation, pulling us into its depths. We grabbed our flashlights, the beams slicing through the night like knives. As we wandered deeper into the woods, the trees closed in around us, their branches twisted like skeletal fingers against the starry sky. We chatted nervously, but the mood shifted when we heard a sudden rustling. It was louder than any animal we'd encountered, like something large was moving through the underbrush. We froze, exchanging anxious glances. Then we heard a low growl that made my skin crawl. It wasn't the sound of a bear or a wolf. This was something different, something wrong. Before we could react, Jenna pointed ahead, her flashlight beam flickering over something in the distance. My heart raced as I strained to see what it was. Through the trees, a figure emerged. A man, or at least, he looked like one. He was tall and gaunt, his skin pale as if he had never seen sunlight. He wore ragged clothes that hung loosely from his body, and his hair was wild, matted with leaves and dirt. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could feel the emptiness in his eyes, like he was staring right through us. We instinctively backed away, trying to remain silent. But in our panic, Jenna accidentally stepped on a twig, the sound snapping through the air like a gunshot. The figure jerked his head toward us, and the growl intensified. Fear took hold, and we bolted into the trees, heartbeats racing and breath coming in short gasps. We ran without direction, branches scratching at our arms and legs as we tore through the underbrush. The growl was now a roar, echoing in the night. We could hear footsteps behind us, heavy and deliberate. It felt like something was chasing us, hunting us. I glanced back and saw the man was following, his face twisted into a grotesque smile. We finally stumbled upon a clearing, and without thinking, we hid behind a thick bush, our bodies pressed together, trembling. We listened as the footsteps grew closer. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. I wanted to scream, but fear locked my voice away. Then silence. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, I thought we had escaped. We remained crouched, hearts pounding, our eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of danger. Just when I thought we were safe, a rustling came from the bush right next to us. I nearly screamed when I turned my flashlight towards it, only to reveal a raccoon, its eyes reflecting the light before it scurried away. But we were not alone. A whisper came from the shadows. It was soft at first, almost indistinguishable. As it grew louder, my heart sank. The voice was low and raspy, calling out Jenna's name. The darkness felt alive, as if the trees themselves were conspiring against us. We dared to look out from behind the bush. To our horror, we saw the figure standing at the edge of the clearing, illuminated by the faint glow of our flashlights. He was now closer, his mouth moving as he chanted Jenna's name over and over, each utterance dripping with malice. Just as I thought we were trapped forever, something incredible happened. The figure suddenly stopped, his eyes widened, and he stumbled back, looking terrified. He turned and fled into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. We were paralyzed, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The chanting stopped, replaced by the sounds of the forest returning to normal. We slowly emerged from our hiding spot, still shaken, but relieved to be alive. As we made our way back to the campsite, we talked about what we had seen. Jenna couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, even in the safety of the campfire. The horror of that night haunted us, but the morning brought a sense of relief. We quickly packed our things and left. Days later, I received a text from Jenna. She had done some research and discovered that the area we camped in was notorious for strange occurrences. Multiple reports of people vanishing had been recorded over the years, always near that same clearing. But what made my blood run cold was the final line of her message. There's something more. They say if you hear your name whispered in the woods, it means they are looking for you. We'd been planning this camping trip for months. A weekend getaway to disconnect, to get away from the noise and distractions of the world. Me and my 3 friends Jake, Ellie, and Tom had spent days picking the perfect spot in the woods, far enough from the trail to feel isolated, but not so far that we'd be completely cut off if anything went wrong. We arrived in the early evening, setting up camp near a small creek that ran through the area. The sun dipped behind the trees as we worked, casting long shadows over the clearing. The air smelled fresh, crisp, with the scent of pine and damp earth. It felt peaceful, idyllic even. That night, we sat around the campfire, eating, joking, and telling stories. It was the kind of atmosphere where you felt safe, surrounded by friends and the flickering warmth of the fire. But then things began to feel off. It started with Ellie. She was sitting closest to the tree line, her back to the forest, when she suddenly froze. At first, we thought she was just being dramatic, messing around like she always did. But then she looked at us, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. I heard something, she said, her voice shaky. We all stopped talking, listening intently. The only sound was the crackling of the fire. Jake stood up, shaking his head. Ellie, there's nothing out there. It's just the wind, or an animal. Don't freak yourself out. But Ellie wasn't convinced. She insisted she heard something movement, like footsteps, just beyond the reach of the firelight. We all stared into the darkness beyond the clearing, but there was nothing there. No movement, no sound. We laughed it off, convincing ourselves she was just letting her imagination run wild. But, as the night wore on, the unease crept back in. The shadows in the trees seemed to shift more than usual, and the air felt heavier, like something was watching us. The woods around us seemed unnaturally still, and the night seemed to stretch on much longer than it should have. At some point, we decided to head to our tents. We doused the fire, the embers glowing faintly in the night. We settled into our sleeping bags, but none of us could sleep. The sounds of the forest had taken on a strange quality, like they were distorted, just out of sync. Every rustle in the brush, every snap of a twig, felt amplified, as though the woods themselves were breathing. Around 3 a.m., we heard it. A loud bang, like something large crashing into a tree. It was so sudden, so sharp, that we all jolted upright in our tents. There was no mistaking it. Something was out there. Tom was the first to grab a flashlight. He crawled out of his tent cautiously, shining the beam toward the woods. For a moment, there was nothing, just the dark, empty trees. But then the beam caught something, a figure. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the darkness. A person? No, not quite. The figure was too still, too unnaturally rigid. It didn't move, just stood there, staring in our direction. We froze. None of us dared to move. The figure didn't make a sound, didn't shift its weight. It just watched. Who the hell is that? Jake hissed, barely above a whisper. We had no idea. We hadn't seen anyone else on the hike-in. No campers, no sign of anyone else around. But there it was, standing like a mannequin in the trees, its head slightly tilted, its limbs unnaturally straight. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling. I was about to call the ranger station when the figure moved. Slowly, it turned, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by strings. "Get inside the tents now," I yelled, grabbing Ellie by the arm and pulling her toward her tent. We scrambled, hearts pounding, breath shallow. The flashlight had flickered out, casting the camp back into darkness. We could hear the figure moving closer, the rustling of branches, the slow scrape of something dragging across the ground. Suddenly, there was a loud thud like a body hitting the ground. Then silence. We waited for what felt like hours, too scared to move, our minds racing with worst-case scenarios. But after a long while, we heard footsteps retreating, disappearing into the woods. One by one, we mustered the courage to step outside, the fear still heavy in our chests. When we checked the area where the figure had stood, we found something strange. It wasn't human at all. It was a mannequin, but not a normal one. This one had its face carved out, no eyes, no mouth, just smooth, empty skin, and on the back of its neck, there was something scrawled in faded red letters. "I see you." We ran back to our cars in the morning, barely stopping to pack up. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, still watching us. And then, as we passed the last turn before the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. There, standing at the edge of the woods, was the mannequin. Still watching. Camping has always been my favorite way to unwind. So, when a few friends and I decided to spend a weekend in the woods, I was thrilled. We found a secluded spot deep in the forest, far from the noise of civilization, and set up camp as the sun dipped below the horizon. The evening air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and the sound of crackling leaves beneath our feet. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing ghost stories that made us all shiver. As the stories got darker, a chill settled over the group. My friend Mia suggested we take a walk through the woods to embrace the eerie atmosphere. She grinned mischievously, claiming it would be fun to get scared together. I felt a surge of apprehension, but also excitement. So, we decided to go. We grabbed our flashlights and set off, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The forest was alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of an owl, and our own laughter echoing between the trees. As we walked deeper into the woods, we started to hear something unusual. It was faint at first, a low clanking sound, like chains dragging across the ground. We paused, exchanging nervous glances, but brushed it off as part of the forest symphony. Then we saw the tiny lights flickering in the distance. At first, they looked like fireflies, but as we approached, the lights grew larger and more distinct. Panic set in as the clanking grew louder, and it felt like the air around us thickened with unease. We decided to hide behind a cluster of bushes, hearts racing and breathless. Peering through the leaves, we saw figures emerging from the trees, each holding a lantern. They were dressed in tattered clothing, their faces obscured by dark hoods. The chains wrapped around their bodies rattled as they moved, creating an unsettling rhythm that sent shivers down my spine. My mind raced with questions. Who were they? What did they want? The figures marched slowly past our hiding spot, their lanterns casting flickering shadows that danced eerily on the trees. I could barely breathe, my heart pounding in my chest. Just as I thought I might burst from the tension, one of the figures turned its head toward us. The hood shifted slightly, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flash of pale skin beneath the darkness. My body tensed, and I could hardly suppress a gasp. But instead of approaching us, they continued on their path, vanishing deeper into the woods. We stayed hidden for what felt like hours, terrified to move. When we finally mustered the courage to leave our hiding spot, we quickly made our way back to the campsite, the panic still coursing through our veins. The fire was still crackling, but the atmosphere had changed. It felt heavier, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. We gathered around the fire, whispering about what we had seen, trying to convince ourselves it was all just a trick of the mind. The night wore on, but none of us could sleep. Every rustle of leaves or snap of twigs made us jump. Finally, as dawn approached, we decided to pack up and leave. We wanted to get out of the woods as quickly as possible. As we gathered our things, we noticed something strange. The area around the fire pit was disturbed, as if something had been dragged through the dirt. My stomach sank as I knelt to examine it. Embedded in the ground were large footprints leading away from our camp, deep and unmistakable. Then, I spotted something glinting near the edge of the firelight. I reached down and pulled out a small, rusted key. Confusion washed over me. What was it doing there? As I turned it over in my hand, the light caught an engraving on the side, the same twisted symbol that had adorned the lanterns of those figures we saw in the woods. Suddenly, a loud crack sounded behind us. We whipped around to see a tree branch falling to the ground. And at that moment, we all felt a cold breeze that seemed to whisper through the trees. We didn't waste another second. With our hearts pounding, we raced to the car, adrenaline fueling our escape. I glanced back one last time at the woods, an unsettling feeling settling deep in my gut. What had we stumbled upon? We drove away, vowing never to return, but the key remained with me. I still wonder who those figures were and what they wanted. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the clanking of chains echoing in my mind, a reminder that some secrets of the woods are best left undiscovered. Last summer, I went camping with my friends Alex and Mia at a secluded spot deep in the forest, a place that was supposed to be perfect for stargazing and roasting marshmallows. We arrived early in the afternoon, set up our tents, and felt a rush of excitement as we ventured into nature, leaving behind the chaos of city life. As evening descended, we built a fire and settled in for a night of ghost stories and laughter. The forest around us was alive with sounds, crickets chirping, leaves rustling, and the occasional hoot of an owl. We were in high spirits, joking and teasing each other about our fears. It was after midnight when things took a strange turn. The fire crackled, and as I leaned back, staring into the dancing flames, I noticed an unsettling silence had fallen over the woods. The crickets had stopped chirping, and an eerie stillness enveloped us. My heart began to race. "Hey, did you guys notice that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Alex and Mia exchanged nervous glances. "Yeah, it's too quiet," Alex said, trying to sound brave, but failing. Suddenly, a faint whisper floated through the air, like the sound of voices carried by the wind. I strained to listen, but the words were indistinct. "Did you hear that?" Mia asked, her eyes wide. "It's probably just the wind," I said, though I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We decided to investigate. Flashlights in hand, we ventured a few steps into the darkness beyond our campfire's glow. As we moved away from the light, the whispers grew louder, wrapping around us like a chilling breeze. It sounded like a chorus of voices, calling from deeper within the woods. "Guys, maybe we should head back," Alex suggested, his voice trembling, but curiosity got the better of us. We pushed further into the trees, drawn by the whispers, which seemed to beckon us closer. The forest felt alive, as if it was watching us, and with every step, the air grew colder. Then, just as we reached a small clearing, the whispers stopped abruptly. We stood there, flashlight beams cutting through the dark, illuminating nothing but trees and underbrush. The silence was deafening. "Okay, this is creepy," Mia said, glancing nervously around. "Let's go back." As we turned to retrace our steps, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a figure, barely visible between the trees. It was tall and shadowy, standing motionless. My breath hitched in my throat. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Before anyone could answer, the figure vanished into the darkness. We stood frozen, hearts pounding, the initial thrill now replaced with dread. "We need to go," I insisted, and without waiting for a reply, I turned and hurried back toward the camp. Alex and Mia followed closely, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the stillness. We reached our campsite and huddled around the fire, too frightened to speak. The whispers never returned, but the feeling of being watched lingered throughout the night. We stayed close to the light, not daring to venture into the dark again. When dawn finally broke, we packed up quickly, eager to leave the forest behind. As we drove away, I glanced back at the trees, wondering what we had encountered. The whispers, the shadowy figure, they haunted me long after we returned home. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night, but I know one thing for sure: some places are best left undisturbed. I've never been the superstitious type, but there's something about the woods at night that can shake anyone's resolve. That's how I found myself telling this story. Years after the incident, it started like any other camping trip with friends. We set up camp late in the afternoon near an old trail, a secluded place we'd been to before. It wasn't a popular spot, so we had the area to ourselves, which was the whole point. The fire crackled while we sat around it, cracking jokes and making plans to hike the next day. Everyone was in a good mood. Nothing out of the ordinary. That was until night fell. The fire was the only light around us. The woods around our little camp were thick, and the only sounds came from the occasional owl hooting in the distance. We weren't in a haunted area, but something about the forest seemed different this time. We tried to shake it off, laughing it off, but there was an unease that grew heavier as the minutes passed. I remember getting up to get more firewood, and that's when I noticed it. The trees weren't moving. Normally, in the woods, even a light breeze makes the branches rustle. But here, everything was still. The only movement came from the flames. It felt wrong, like the woods were holding their breath. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was nothing, but the silence kept pressing down on me. When I got back to the fire, I mentioned it casually to the others. They laughed it off, of course, but then we all heard it. A low, distant humming sound, not like the wind, but more like a tune. It was eerie too eerie for any of us to take lightly. My friend Alan was the first to speak up. He said it sounded like chanting, but I didn't want to admit that it gave me the same feeling. He wanted to investigate, but everyone was already on edge. We agreed to stay close to the fire, even if it meant looking paranoid. The humming seemed to get closer, and then it stopped. That's when the first jump scare hit. Out of nowhere, something large and heavy crashed into the trees behind us. I thought it was an animal, but the noise was so unnatural, so forceful. It was like something was thrashing around, trying to make its way through the brush. But it wasn't moving like an animal. It was more like something struggling to get to us, something angry. We all froze. The fire flickered and popped. Our nerves were frayed, but no one moved. The humming started again, quieter this time, and in the silence that followed, it almost felt as though something was watching us. Alan wanted to run and check it out, but I stopped him. I couldn't explain why, but my instincts told me staying put was the only way to be safe. Then the real terror hit. The trees near the edge of our camp started to shake. I saw movement shapes, shadows flitting between the trunks. It was fast, too fast, and it wasn't a human shape. It was tall, hunched, like something trying to stay hidden, but it couldn't. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its eyes. They were watching us. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry. Everyone else was just as still. We didn't even make a sound. We just waited, frozen. Then came the worst part. The ground trembled under our feet. We couldn't tell if it was a tremor or something heavier. The humming turned into a deep growl, and the trees began to crack. Then we heard a voice, clear, sharp. It didn't sound human. It came from somewhere far off, but it echoed as if it was coming from right next to us. Stay away. Those two words shook me to my core. No one moved. We were stuck, glued to the spot. I can't even remember how long we stayed there, but it felt like hours. The shadows started to fade, the trembling stopped, and the eerie humming turned back into silence. Then, just as we thought it was over, we heard a different sound. This time, it was close. Something was walking around our camp, slow and deliberate. I could hear footsteps, to heavy, to slow. My heart hammered in my chest, and my breath came in sharp gasps. I thought it was something real, something we couldn't escape. But when I turned to Alan, I saw the fear in his eyes. I knew we weren't alone, but this wasn't what we thought. The footsteps didn't stop. Then, out of nowhere, the fire blinked out, and the world went pitch black. We were completely surrounded, but we still couldn't move. My hands shook, and I heard breathing too close. When the light came back, we saw something on the ground. A small, old-fashioned lantern sat in the dirt. It wasn't ours. We never found out who or what had left it there. The chanting faded. The trees resumed their normal stillness. But from that moment on, we didn't speak of what had happened, except in whispers. And if you ever find yourself camping alone, listen carefully. The forest has its own way of communicating. I can't explain it, but I know that voice was a warning. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway. Just me and a few friends escaping the grind of everyday life. We'd picked a remote campsite tucked deep in a forest, miles away from civilization. We didn't tell anyone where we were going. We didn't want to risk being interrupted. The first day was perfect. The sun was warm, the air crisp, and the forest smelled of pine and earth. We set up our tents, built a fire, and spent hours talking, laughing, and eating. As night fell, we gathered around the fire, the flames dancing, casting eerie shadows on the trees. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the distant hoots of owls, but something felt off from the beginning. There was an unnatural stillness in the air, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to shake it off. There's nothing scarier than the woods at night. Right. That's just the way it goes. Around midnight, we decided to go for a short night hike. We grabbed our flashlights and set off into the forest. The moonlight filtered through the branches, casting an otherworldly glow on everything. The air grew colder, the darkness more oppressive. Our laughter died down, and the silence wrapped around us like a heavy cloak. As we walked deeper into the woods, I felt a strange sensation crawling up my spine. A feeling of being watched, but I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the night playing tricks on my mind. That's when we heard the first sound, a twig snapping behind us. We froze, the air thick with tension. I spun around, my flashlight swinging wildly, but there was nothing. My heart pounded in my chest. One of my friends, Matt, chuckled nervously. "You're just paranoid," he said, though his voice didn't sound entirely convinced. We kept walking, but the feeling didn't go away. The forest seemed to be closing in on us. The shadows were longer now, stretching like fingers from the trees. The further we walked, the heavier the silence became. It wasn't natural. The usual night sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, had all gone quiet. Then, another snap. This time, it was closer. Much closer. We all turned in unison, scanning the trees with our flashlights. But again, nothing. "Okay, I'm starting to get freaked out," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. We didn't go back immediately, but we sped up, our footsteps quickening as we tried to make our way back to camp. That's when I heard it, the soft, rhythmic sound of something following us. Footsteps, but not like ours, too heavy, too deliberate. I could feel my pulse in my throat. "Are we being followed?" I whispered, too afraid to speak louder. Matt shook his head, but his eyes were wide, scanning the trees. No way. We kept walking faster, but the footsteps didn't stop. They were getting closer, closer with every passing second. It was like whatever was behind us knew we were afraid. It was toying with us, making sure we knew it was there. Suddenly, there was a loud, deafening crash behind us, followed by a guttural growl, a sound that made my blood freeze in my veins. My flashlight flickered, then went out completely. Panic surged. I could barely breathe. Matt's voice cracked as he yelled, "Run!" We sprinted back to camp, my legs burning, my lungs aching. The footsteps weren't behind us anymore. Now, they were in front of us, moving faster, closing in. We burst out of the woods and into the clearing where our campfire still burned, casting its flickering light across the campsite. We didn't stop. We didn't even look back. We dove into the tents, our hearts racing, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. We lay there, frozen, listening. The sounds of the forest had returned. The crickets, the rustling leaves, the distant owl. But something was different. The wind shifted, and for a split second, I could smell something rancid like rot. We didn't sleep that night. We stayed in the tents, wide awake, whispering in terrified voices. By morning, the tension had not lifted, but we packed up in silence. The drive back was equally unnerving. We didn't speak much, just glancing nervously at the woods as we passed. But the worst part, we didn't realize it until we got home. I checked my phone, and there was a picture. One I didn't take, a photo of us, standing in the woods, smiling. But there was someone else in the background, a shadowy figure, partially hidden behind a tree, its face obscured. And it wasn't until I zoomed in that I saw it. The figure was grinning. And it wasn't one of us. We never spoke about that weekend again. It was supposed to be a fun weekend camping trip with friends, a chance to disconnect from the world and reconnect with nature. We drove deep into the woods, far from any civilization, surrounded by towering trees and the chirping of crickets. The sun hung low in the sky as we set up our tents, laughing and joking as we prepared for a night under the stars. As darkness fell, we gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing ghost stories. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and pine, and our laughter echoed in the stillness of the forest. As the fire crackled, Yena, always the adventurous one, suggested we take a night hike to explore the area. We hesitated for a moment, glancing at the dense blackness beyond our campfire's glow. But her enthusiasm was infectious. With flashlights in hand, we set off into the woods. The deeper we ventured, the more the atmosphere shifted. The playful sounds of our camp faded, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to absorb even our whispers. I could feel the chill in the air, a shiver creeping up my spine, but I brushed it off as excitement. Yena led the way, her flashlight beam darting across the trees, illuminating the twisted roots and gnarled branches. The darkness felt alive, watching us as we walked. Suddenly, I heard a faint sound, a strange rustling in the underbrush behind us. I turned, peering into the dark, but saw nothing. The others seemed oblivious, too caught up in their conversation. I hurried to catch up, shaking off the unease. But as we continued deeper into the forest, the rustling returned, louder this time, like something was following us. My heart raced, and I called out to the group, but my voice wavered. They paused, and Yena turned, her face illuminated by the flashlight, concern etched on her features. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice steady but low. I hesitated, unsure if I should share my paranoia. "I think something's out there," I said, forcing a laugh to mask my fear. Just then, we all heard a loud clank, metal against metal, echoing through the trees. The laughter died in our throats, replaced by a shared glance of dread. Yena shone her flashlight toward the sound, revealing a shadow moving between the trees, but it was gone before we could make out what it was. Panic rose in my chest as the chains rattled again, and we exchanged terrified looks. "Let's go back," Matt said, his voice barely above a whisper. Nods of agreement followed, and we turned, but before we could take a step, the rustling intensified, and a series of lights appeared in the distance, moving slowly toward us. Lanterns bobbed along the forest floor, casting an eerie glow on the trees. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. We ducked behind a thick bush, pressing against each other in fear. From our hiding place, we watched as figures emerged from the shadows. They were draped in white cloth, their faces obscured by grotesque masks, each carrying a lantern that flickered ominously. My stomach churned as I counted at least 10 of them, marching in eerie synchronization, chains rattling around their ankles. "What the hell are they?" Aaron muttered, eyes wide. I had no answer, but a chilling fear coursed through me. The figures continued past us, their footsteps muffled by the underbrush, the light from their lanterns flickering ominously. We held our breath, waiting for what felt like an eternity, until they finally vanished into the darkness. Once we were sure they were gone, we scrambled back to camp, adrenaline fueling our movements. As we arrived, our relief turned to horror. Our campsite was ransacked, tents overturned, the fire extinguished, and the food scattered. But it was what lay on the ground that made my blood run cold. In the dirt, words were etched with something sharp. "We know you're here." Screams of panic erupted from my friends as we grabbed what we could, the realization of our vulnerability sinking in. We bolted to the car, frantically packing our belongings, hearts racing with terror. But just as we were about to leave, Yena screamed again, pointing into the woods. There they were, those same figures, standing at the edge of the tree line, lanterns glowing in the dark. I slammed the car door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. We drove away, leaving the horrors behind. But as we passed the edge of the forest, I caught a glimpse of one of the figures standing among the trees, its mask staring blankly at us, lantern held high, as if to say we were never truly alone. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that those masked figures are still out there, waiting in the dark. Camping had always been my escape from the chaos of everyday life. When my friend suggested a weekend trip to a remote site deep in the woods, I jumped at the chance. We packed our gear, loaded up the car, and drove until the city lights vanished behind us. The excitement buzzed in the air as we set up camp, and I felt an undeniable thrill at the prospect of sleeping under the stars. As night fell, the forest transformed, shadows deepened, and the sounds of nocturnal creatures filled the air. We gathered around the fire, sharing stories and laughter, the flames casting flickering shadows on our faces. But as the night wore on, A strange unease settled over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Around midnight, my friend Jenna suggested we explore the woods a bit further. Feeling adventurous and slightly emboldened by the warmth of the fire, we agreed. Armed with flashlights, we ventured into the darkness, the beam of light slicing through the thick air. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, and every rustle made my heart race. As we walked deeper into the woods, a cold wind swept through the trees, chilling me to the bone. Then, from somewhere nearby, we heard it, a low, guttural sound. My stomach twisted into knots, and I exchanged nervous glances with my friends. Jenna, ever the jokester, laughed it off and urged us to keep going. Despite my instinct screaming to turn back, I followed, curiosity overriding my fear. Then we saw it. A flickering light in the distance, just beyond a thicket of trees. It glowed like a beacon, and we instinctively moved toward it. As we approached, I felt a rising sense of dread. The light danced erratically, illuminating something that looked like figures standing in a clearing. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Suddenly, the sound of chains clanking filled the air, growing louder and closer. Panic surged through me, and we all froze. What were those figures? Were they real? Jenna whispered that we should hide, and we quickly ducked behind a large tree, our hearts pounding. Peering around the trunk, we saw the figures more clearly. They were cloaked in ragged white fabric, their faces obscured by masks that were painted to resemble anguished expressions. Each figure held a lantern, and the light glinted off the chains wrapped around their bodies. They moved slowly, almost like they were searching for something. The clinking of their chains echoed ominously through the stillness of the night. My pulse raced as fear gripped me. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. Just then, one of the figures turned, and for a moment, our eyes locked. The mask hid its face, but I felt a chill run down my spine, as if it were staring directly into my soul. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I remained frozen, paralyzed by terror. The figures began to move again, continuing their slow march through the woods. As they faded into the distance, I finally found my voice. "We should get back to camp," I urged, my heart pounding in my ears. The others nodded, their faces pale, and we turned to make our way back. We stumbled through the darkness, adrenaline fueling our every step. As we broke through the trees and reached our campsite, relief washed over me. But that relief was short-lived. Our camp was in disarray. The tents were torn, and the fire had been doused. Panic gripped us again. What happened here? Jenna screamed when she spotted something on the ground. We rushed over, and my stomach dropped. There, scratched into the earth, were the words, "We will find you." The message was clear and chilling. We gathered what we could and raced to the car, each of us glancing over our shoulders as if expecting to see those figures emerge from the shadows. As we sped away, the forest receding behind us, I thought about the figures. They had looked so surreal, so dreamlike, yet the fear they inspired felt painfully real. I glanced back one last time, and for a split second, I thought I saw one of the masked figures standing at the edge of the trees, lantern glowing softly in the darkness, watching us leave. That image haunts me still, a terrifying reminder that some things in the woods are better left undisturbed. I never spoke of that night to anyone, afraid they might think I was losing my grip on reality. Sometimes, when I find myself alone at night, the memory of those chains clanking sends a chill through my bones, and I wonder if they ever really let us go. We had been planning this camping trip for weeks, a chance to escape the chaos of city life and immerse ourselves in nature. My friends and I arrived at the campsite just before sunset, setting up our tents in a secluded area surrounded by towering trees. The air was crisp and fresh, filled with the earthy scent of pine needles and damp soil. We spent the early evening cooking over the fire, laughing and sharing stories, while the stars began to prick the darkening sky. As darkness settled in, the atmosphere shifted. My friend Lucas, always the jokester, suggested we play a game of truth or dare to spice things up. Amid laughter and playful taunts, Yena, my adventurous friend, dared us to take a night hike into the woods. With a mix of excitement and trepidation, we agreed, grabbing our flashlights and heading into the shadows. The deeper we ventured, the more the forest came alive. The trees loomed around us, their branches creaking in the wind like ghostly whispers. As we walked, I felt an unsettling sensation, like we were being watched. I brushed it off as nerves, convincing myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on my mind. We wandered for what felt like an eternity, our laughter fading as we noticed the forest growing eerily quiet. Just then, a sharp sound pierced the silence, a loud crack, like something heavy breaking through the branches. We all froze, shining our flashlights toward the noise. In the distance, we saw a flicker of light, like a lantern bobbing between the trees. "What is that?" I whispered, my heart racing. Lucas squinted into the darkness, a grin creeping across his face. "Probably just some campers. Let's check it out." Despite my instincts telling me to turn back, curiosity got the better of us. We crept through the underbrush, the flickering light growing brighter as we approached. The air became thick with tension, each step feeling like a mistake. Then, out of nowhere, the lights vanished. "Where did it go?" Yena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before we could answer, the sounds of chains rattling filled the air, sending chills down my spine. Panic washed over us, and we instinctively dove behind a thick bush. Heart pounding, we peered out to see what was happening. My mind raced as I fought to control my breathing. Then we saw them. Figures cloaked in dark, tattered clothing emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured by grotesque masks that glimmered in the darkness. Each figure was shackled, chains dragging behind them as they moved with a disturbing, slow grace. Lanterns hung from their hands, illuminating their path and casting haunting shadows on the trees. My stomach dropped as I realized we were not supposed to be here. My instincts screamed for us to run, but we were frozen in place, horror rendering us immobile. The figures shuffled closer, their chains clanking ominously, and for a moment, it felt like the world around us had shrunk to just us and them. I felt Gina's grip tighten on my arm, her nails digging into my skin. I opened my mouth to whisper something reassuring, but no words came. Instead, we watched, breathless, as the procession passed mere feet from our hiding place. I thought I saw one of them glance in our direction, but the lantern's light obscured their eyes. Once the figures moved on, we wasted no time scrambling back the way we came. Adrenaline coursed through my veins as we raced through the underbrush, branches clawing at our clothes. We burst out of the trees, breathless and terrified, collapsing beside our campfire. But when we reached our campsite, we were met with a shocking sight. Our tents lay toppled, gear scattered across the ground. The fire was extinguished, its embers barely glowing. As we scrambled to gather our things, I noticed something carved into the dirt near the fire pit. "You should not have come." A wave of fear washed over us, and we grabbed our belongings in a frenzy, not bothering to gather everything. As we made our way to the car, I glanced back at the campsite one last time. There was no sign of the figures, but the air felt thick with their presence. We drove away, hearts pounding, vowing never to return. But, as we sped down the winding road, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of a flickering light. It faded quickly, but the sense of dread remained. What if those figures had followed us? What if they were still watching? The dark woods behind us seemed to breathe, hiding secrets I hoped never to uncover. Camping under a starlit sky always felt like an escape into another world, a raw kind of freedom you only get in nature. We were miles from any road, wrapped in the deep silence of the forest, only the crackling fire breaking the quiet. There were 3 of us, me, my friend, and his little brother. It was their first real camping trip, so I was the expert, having been camping a few times before. But something about this night was different. Even before we arrived, I felt a vague unease, an odd feeling of being watched from somewhere beyond the trees. As darkness crept in, the usual sounds of the forest seemed strangely muted. No chirping insects, no rustle of small animals in the brush. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to nerves, and settled into a story, hoping to lighten the mood. As I spoke, though, I noticed my friend's brother staring into the woods, his face pale in the glow of the fire. He whispered that he saw something out there, just beyond the tree line. My friend and I laughed, teasing him about letting his imagination run wild, but the fear in his eyes didn't waver. Trying to calm him down, I aimed my flashlight at the spot he'd been staring at. For a second, everything looked normal. But as I panned the light along the edge of the trees, I caught a glimpse of something moving, a flash of white, slipping quickly out of sight. I froze, and so did my friends. My friend forced a chuckle, muttering about animals in the woods. Probably a deer or a raccoon, he said. But something about the way it moved, it was too smooth, too deliberate, and it was silent. No crackling leaves, no snapping twigs, nothing. We tried to laugh it off, throwing another log on the fire and talking louder than necessary, anything to shake the growing tension. But that feeling didn't go away, and the forest only seemed to get darker, more oppressive, about an hour later. As we sat by the fire, my friend's brother suddenly grabbed my arm, his nails digging into my skin. He didn't say anything, just pointed behind me, his eyes wide with terror. I turned slowly, my heart pounding, but saw nothing. Just trees and shadows. We tried to settle down, each of us lying down in our sleeping bags around the dying fire. But none of us could sleep. I could feel every sound, every faint rustle, and I sensed my friends lying awake too, tense and silent. Then I heard a whisper. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but it grew louder, clearer, like it was right in my ear, though I was lying alone. It didn't make sense. The words were soft, unintelligible, like someone mumbling, just out of reach. I sat up, looking around, but I saw nothing. My friends were both wide-eyed, hearing it just as suddenly, the whispering stopped. We sat there, our breath shallow, when a loud crack echoed from the trees behind us, followed by what sounded like footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, drawing closer. I shined my flashlight toward the sound, and my heart nearly stopped. There, at the edge of the light, stood a figure. It was pale, almost translucent, with long, thin limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally from its body. Its face was blank, almost featureless, but its eyes were wide open, unblinking, and staring straight at me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure tilted its head, as if it were studying us, before melting back into the darkness as silently as it had come. We didn't say a word, just packed up and left, stumbling through the dark, tripping over roots and rocks in our haste to escape. We kept moving until the first hint of dawn touched the sky, until we were far from that place. It was only later, when we had finally made it home and were safe within four walls, that my friend's brother spoke up, his voice barely a whisper. He told us he'd seen it, the same figure, in his room every night since we'd returned, just standing there, in the dark, watching him with those wide, unblinking eyes. I'd been excited about the camping trip for weeks. The idea of leaving behind work, phones, and city noise sounded like a perfect escape. Our plan was simple: hike out to a secluded spot, set up camp, and enjoy the peace of the forest. By the time we reached the clearing we'd chosen, the sun was already setting, casting long shadows across the trees. We set up camp, lit a fire, and settled down. It was strangely quiet, with only the occasional rustle or snap of twigs in the distance. As we ate, we laughed about spooky campfire stories and joked about which one of us would freak out first. But as the night wore on, that playful mood started to fade. The fire dimmed, and the forest grew colder, darker, and heavier. Then, out of nowhere, there was a loud snap, a branch breaking. We froze, each of us straining to see past the ring of firelight. Probably an animal, I said, but my voice shook a little. We laughed it off, but the tension lingered. Eventually, we turned in for the night. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tightly, and settled into my sleeping bag. Lying there, I heard the wind whispering through the trees. It sounded hollow and strange. Then, faintly at first, but growing louder, came a scratching sound. My heart hammered. The noise was right outside my tent, slow and deliberate, like fingernails scraping across the fabric. I held my breath, listening. Then, suddenly, my tent's flap jerked. Something or someone was tugging on it from the outside, grabbing my flashlight. I forced myself to unzip the tent just enough to peek out. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything past the trees. Just empty shadows. I lay back down, breathing slowly to calm myself. Then I heard a whisper, faint and hoarse, right outside my tent. "Don't look." I froze, a cold sweat covering my skin. The whisper had been right by my ear, as if someone were inside the tent with me. My mind raced, and I tried to convince myself it was just the wind. But the whisper came again, louder this time. "Don't look." I grabbed my knife. Though I didn't know what good it would do, I lay still, barely daring to breathe, but then my flashlight flickered, casting weird shadows along the walls of the tent. Suddenly, the flap jerked again, harder this time, as if something were trying to get in. I couldn't take it anymore. I threw the tent open and scrambled out, panting and shining my light around the campsite. My friends were emerging from their tents too, their faces pale. "Did you hear that?" one of them whispered. I nodded, unable to find words. Then we all heard a faint, echoing whisper from the darkness. "Don't look." A chill shot down my spine, and I fought the urge to turn and run. But before I could, I caught a glimpse of something in the shadows, a figure, impossibly tall and thin, watching us from behind the trees. We didn't wait to investigate. We grabbed our bags and started running down the trail, our flashlights bobbing wildly. I was breathing hard, too afraid to look back, but then I heard the whisper again, louder this time, "Goodbye." We didn't stop running until we reached the car, and we drove out of there without looking back. It's been months since that night, and none of us have been able to explain what we saw or heard. But the most chilling part came weeks later, when I was looking through our camping photos. In one of the last photos from that night, in the background just beyond the firelight, was a faint outline, tall, thin, and standing perfectly still. It was a late autumn evening when I began my shift as a park ranger. The air was crisp, and the last vestiges of daylight seeped through the dense canopy of trees, casting long shadows on the forest floor. I loved this time of year. The vibrant colors, the quiet that enveloped the woods as most campers had already packed up for the season. I took my first stroll down the main trail, making sure everything was in order. About an hour into my rounds, I received a radio call from a family camping near the far end of the park. They reported odd noises outside their tent, sounds that didn't match the usual wildlife. I assured them I would head over immediately. Their campsite was a good hike away, and with each step, I felt the growing tension in the air, as if the woods were holding their breath. By the time I reached their site, the sun had completely vanished. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped into the clearing. The tent was unzipped, and I called out, but no one answered. I shone my flashlight into the tent. Their belongings were scattered inside, but the family was nowhere to be found. I felt a wave of unease wash over me. That's when I heard a low growl, deep and guttural, reverberating through the trees. It sent a shiver racing up my spine. I turned off my flashlight, straining to hear better. The growl came again, louder, closer. It wasn't a bear. It felt almost human, twisted in some unnatural way. I backed out of the tent slowly, my heart pounding. As I stepped outside, the hairs on my neck stood on end. My flashlight flickered, and I could have sworn I saw movement at the edge of the clearing. I called out for the family, my voice shaky and barely audible. Then, just at the tree line, I saw a figure, tall and thin, partially obscured by darkness. It stood unnaturally still, its head tilted at an odd angle. I felt my pulse quicken. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, but the creature took a step forward, and I could see its face, or what I thought was a face. It was pale, featureless except for deep, hollow eye sockets. My breath caught in my throat as it let out another growl, echoing through the night. I sprinted back to my vehicle, adrenaline propelling me forward. I fumbled for the radio, trying to call for backup, but the static crackled loudly, making my heart race even faster. I finally managed to get a message out, desperate for someone to respond. I jumped into the truck and locked the doors, staring out into the abyss of trees surrounding me. Moments felt like hours, and I was about to lose hope when another ranger arrived, his headlights cutting through the darkness. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as he stepped out. I quickly explained what I had seen, my words tumbling out in a rush. He listened intently, and as we prepared to search for the family, we heard something, the unmistakable sound of laughter echoing through the trees. Confused, we followed the sound. It led us deeper into the woods, where the trees were so thick I could hardly see. Then we stumbled into a small clearing. There they were, the family, huddled around a small campfire, roasting marshmallows and laughing like nothing was wrong. I felt my heart drop. I rushed toward them, demanding to know where they had been. The father looked at me with a puzzled expression. They had heard the growl, but assumed it was just a bear and decided to wait it out. I was flooded with relief, but something felt off. as we gathered around the fire. I noticed the mother was pale, her hands trembling. She glanced nervously toward the trees. I followed her gaze, and suddenly, the air grew cold. The laughter faded, replaced by a low, haunting growl. The family's faces turned to shock as the figure stepped into the light. Its movement slow and deliberate, but then it stopped, hovering at the edge of the firelight. I was sure it would attack, but instead, it turned its head and looked directly at me, those hollow eye sockets boring into my soul. Just as I opened my mouth to scream, the fire flared up brightly, and in that moment, the figure simply vanished. The family stood frozen, their faces white with fear. The growl faded into silence. We all looked at one another, unsure of what had just happened. What was real? Had I imagined the creature? Or had it truly been there? The night ended with us all packed tightly together around the campfire, the eerie silence settling around us like a shroud. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that the woods are not as empty as they seem. I hear whispers in the wind and feel eyes watching me. Whatever was lurking in the shadows that night might not be gone for good. I had always loved the deep woods. As a park ranger, I spent my days exploring trails and checking on campers. That summer had been particularly quiet. Most families had left for the season, and I found myself patrolling areas that were usually bustling with life. The trees stood like silent sentinels, and the sounds of the forest seemed amplified in the stillness. One late afternoon, I received a call on the radio from a family camping deep in the woods. They reported strange noises outside their tent. At first, I brushed it off as wildlife, perhaps a deer or a raccoon, but the father's voice trembled with fear as he described the sounds. It was too rhythmic, he insisted, not like anything they had heard before. Something in his tone sent a chill down my spine. I grabbed my gear and made my way to their campsite, feeling a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. The sun dipped below the horizon, and shadows stretched long and thin across the ground. As I walked, the familiar path became less inviting, the air heavy with an unshakable sense of dread. I reached the campsite as darkness fell, and the only light came from the flickering glow of their campfire. The family, a mother, father, and 2 children, sat huddled together, their faces pale. They explained that the noises had started as low growls, but soon morphed into something more unsettling and eerie chanting that seemed to echo through the trees. I scanned the area, feeling the weight of their fear settling in my chest. The father pointed toward the woods, his finger trembling. It was then that I heard a distant, rhythmic sound that pierced through the silence. It didn't sound like any animal I knew. The chant was muffled, yet it resonated with an unnatural quality that made my skin crawl. I felt a chill wind swirl around us, sending leaves swirling in chaotic patterns. I told the family to stay by the fire, and I stepped away, shining my flashlight into the darkened woods. The beam danced nervously over the trees, illuminating nothing but the bark and shadows. The chanting seemed to grow louder, creeping closer. I retraced my steps back to the family, but just as I turned, I noticed something moving in the darkness. A tall figure slipped between the trees, its form almost blending into the night. I swallowed hard, convinced my imagination was playing tricks on me. It wasn't unusual for rangers to feel unnerved at night, but I felt compelled to investigate. I told the family to stay put and quietly approached the edge of the forest. The chanting stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence that pressed down on me like a weight. As I stepped deeper into the trees, the atmosphere shifted. The air turned cold, and the familiar sounds of the woods faded away. I could hear only my heartbeat echoing in my ears, pounding louder as I ventured further into the unknown. I trained my flashlight on the path ahead, but the beam flickered ominously, threatening to go out completely. Suddenly, the chanting erupted again, louder and more urgent. I could feel it reverberate through my bones. It seemed to come from all around me, as if the trees themselves were alive and whispering secrets. Panic surged within me, but I pushed forward, determined to uncover the source. Then I saw a circle of strange symbols etched into the ground, surrounded by twisted branches that formed a crude barrier. The figure I had seen earlier stood at the center, but it was not human. It was tall and thin, with elongated limbs and glowing eyes that reflected my flashlight like mirrors. My breath caught in my throat as it turned toward me, its face a void, a black pit that seemed to swallow the light. I stumbled back, heart racing, but the family was just behind me, having followed out of concern. I turned to them, shouting for them to run, but before I could react, the figure lunged. I stumbled backward, expecting the worst, but instead, the ground erupted in a flash of light. The symbols glowed bright, illuminating the woods for a brief moment, before plunging everything back into darkness. The creature vanished, leaving only a lingering echo of its chant behind. The family looked at me, their faces a mix of fear and confusion. I led them back to the campsite, my heart still pounding. The strange occurrences continued through the night, but we remained together, the family's presence grounding me. In the morning, we reported everything to the authorities, but when the search teams returned to the site, they found nothing, no symbols, no signs of the creature. The family and I were left with our memories, the knowledge of what we had experienced buried within us. As the family packed up to leave, I realized something chilling. The chanting had stopped, but the echo of those glowing eyes lingered in my mind, a haunting reminder that sometimes the woods hold secrets best left undiscovered. As a park ranger, I had seen my fair share of strange occurrences in the deep woods, but nothing could prepare me for what happened on that chilly October evening. It was the end of the camping season, and the air was filled with a crispness that hinted at the winter to come. I was on patrol, ensuring the last few campers packed up and left before dark. I was nearing a secluded part of the park when I noticed a flickering light through the trees. Curious, I veered off the trail, thinking it might be a camper who had lost their way. The forest grew denser as I approached, and the sunlight dimmed. It felt like I had stepped into another world, one where the shadows loomed heavier, and the air turned thick with tension. As I crept closer, I saw a tent. The glow of a lantern inside flickered rhythmically, casting ghostly shadows. I called out, but there was no response. I cautiously stepped up to the tent and unzipped the flap. Inside was a family: mom, dad, and 2 kids, all huddled together, fear etched on their faces. I asked what was wrong, and they glanced at each other, their eyes wide. The father spoke in a hushed tone, saying they heard strange noises outside. At first, they thought it was just the wind, but as the night progressed, it grew more unsettling. He mentioned hearing what sounded like whispers and the rustling of leaves. But then came the worst part. Just before I arrived, they saw a shadow pass by their tent, something tall and thin, that walked onto legs, but didn't look entirely human. I tried to reassure them, telling them it was probably just a deer or another animal. But the uneasy feeling in my gut told me otherwise. I suggested they pack up and follow me back to the ranger station. They agreed, relieved to leave the tent behind. As we began to gather their things, I noticed something strange outside. The whispering had returned. It was a low, unintelligible sound, echoing from the depths of the trees. The family froze, their eyes darting around, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, but all I could see was the black expanse of trees. The whispers grew louder, swirling around us like an angry wind. I told everyone to stay close and led them away from the tent, my heart racing. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from behind us. We turned to see the lantern flicker violently before going dark. Panic surged through the family as I pushed them to move faster. We trudged through the underbrush, branches snagging at our clothes, the whispers following us, echoing like a taunt. The feeling of being haunted crept into my bones. We reached the trail, and relief flooded over me as we emerged into the dim light of dusk. I hurried the family along the path, keeping an eye over my shoulder. That's when I saw it. A tall, gaunt figure stood at the edge of the trees, its eyes glowing like embers in the fading light. My blood ran cold as the whispers shifted to a chilling laughter that made my stomach churn. I urged the family to keep moving, and we hurried down the path, adrenaline pumping through my veins. We finally reached the ranger station, where I quickly ushered them inside. As I locked the door behind us, I glanced back out into the woods. The figure was gone, but the laughter lingered, an echo that hung in the air. After the family calmed down, I began to explain what had happened, hoping to downplay the fear. But just then, the radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. It was another ranger reporting strange noises and shadows seen near a different campsite. My heart dropped as the realization hit me there were more campers in danger. I turned to the family and promised them they would be safe inside while I went to assist. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had interrupted something that shouldn't be disturbed, something that was now angry at us for our intrusion. As I ventured back into the woods, the laughter returned, taunting me. I followed the sounds. Each step felt like a descent into madness. The trees closed in around me, and suddenly I tripped over a root, tumbling to the ground. When I looked up, the figure loomed over me, closer than before. I scrambled to my feet and bolted back toward the station, bursting through the door. I slammed it shut and locked it, breathing heavily. I turned to find the family staring at me, their faces pale. But behind them, in the shadows, stood the very same figure that had chased us. Its eyes flickered in the dim light, a sinister grin spreading across its face. And in that moment, I understood the truth. The woods were alive, and it would always have a way to reclaim what was taken from it. The laughter echoed in my ears, and I knew we had merely survived a night in its domain. But as long as we remained vigilant, perhaps we could outlast its terrifying grasp. As a park ranger, I had always been drawn to the solitude of the deep woods. The crisp air, the sounds of nature, and the occasional visit from campers made the job rewarding. One particular October evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I received a call over the radio. A family had set up camp near a remote area, and they were anxious about strange noises coming from the woods. I assured them I would investigate and headed out with my flashlight and gear. The deeper I ventured into the forest, the darker it became. The trees loomed like ancient sentinels, their branches whispering secrets in the wind. I found the campsite nestled among the pines, a flickering campfire barely illuminating the anxious faces of the family. They were huddled close together, their expressions a mix of fear and concern. I asked what they had heard, and the father, his voice trembling, described a low growl and snapping branches echoing from the woods. The mother clutched her children, eyes wide with terror. I promised to check the perimeter and reassured them that it was likely just a bear or some other wildlife. The family nodded but remained visibly shaken. As I walked beyond their camp, the forest felt alive, each rustle amplifying my anxiety. I swept my flashlight across the darkened trees, scanning for movement. The growling had subsided, replaced by an eerie silence that set my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. After about 20 minutes of searching, I returned to the family. They looked relieved to see me, but were still on high alert. I suggested they stay close to the fire and try to get some rest while I kept watch. I positioned myself a few yards from their tent, feeling the weight of the darkness pressing in around me. As the hours passed, the silence was punctuated by the occasional crackling of the fire and the distant call of an owl. Then, just as I began to relax, I heard it again, a low growl, deeper this time, resonating through the trees. My heart raced as I shined my flashlight toward the sound, illuminating nothing but the shadows of the forest. I took a deep breath and walked toward the sound, my senses heightened. The growl was now accompanied by snapping twigs. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing an unsettling sight. A tall figure stood at the edge of the trees, its outline indistinct. It looked almost human, but something was wrong. It was too tall, too slender, and it didn't move like a person. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to remain calm. I called out, asking if anyone was there. No response came, just a low growl that echoed back to me. Suddenly, the figure lunged toward me, and I stumbled backward, the beam of my flashlight flickering as I tripped over a root. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, and ran back to the camp. The family was awake, eyes wide with fear. I told them to pack their things quickly, whatever it was in the woods. I could feel it was not friendly. They hurriedly stuffed their belongings into their bags, their hands trembling. As they finished, I led them to the path back to my truck, keeping my flashlight trained on the darkened trees. Just as we reached the trailhead, the air grew cold, and I turned back to glance at the woods. The figure stood just beyond the tree line, watching us. I felt a chill run down my spine, but pushed the family forward. We hurried to the truck, and I fumbled for the keys, my fingers shaking. Just as I got the door open, a loud crash echoed from the forest, followed by a terrifying roar. I threw the family inside and slammed the door. I could feel the adrenaline surging through me as I started the engine. The headlights illuminated the edge of the woods, revealing the figure again, closer this time, its face twisted in a grotesque grin. I backed out and drove away as fast as I could. The family was silent, and the only sound was the hum of the engine. Finally, I turned to them and asked if they had seen anything. They exchanged confused looks, and then began to speak. The father insisted he had seen the figure, but the children only remembered shadows. The mother looked at me, her eyes wide. Then she pointed to the back of the truck. I turned, and my stomach dropped. There was a face pressed against the window, twisted and contorted, mirroring the grotesque smile I had seen earlier. The moment my heart stopped, the face vanished, leaving only the darkness behind. We all sat in stunned silence, realizing that whatever had been watching us was still out there, lingering just beyond the reach of our light. Camping in the woods had always been a cherished tradition among my friends and me. This trip, however, felt different. The forest was eerily quiet, and even the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves were absent. We set up camp, four of us, Yena, Matt, Aaron, and I. As night descended, the atmosphere grew thick with an unsettling tension. After dinner, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we decided to take a walk. Yena suggested we explore the woods under the moonlight, laughing nervously about how spooky it would be. Fueled by the thrill of adventure and maybe a little fear, we agreed. With flashlights in hand, we ventured deeper into the trees, the path illuminated only by the beams of our lights. Initially, we were caught up in the beauty of the night, the shimmering stars above and the soft glow of the moon filtering through the branches. But soon, the sounds of the forest began to change. A distant rustle, a snap of a twig, and the uncomfortable feeling that something was watching us settled in. The further we walked, the heavier the air felt around us. Then we heard it, a soft clanking, like metal against metal, echoing through the trees. My heart raced as I turned to my friends, their faces mirroring my unease. It seemed to be coming from the direction we had just walked, and in a moment of collective panic, we decided to hide. We ducked behind some thick bushes, our breaths shallow as we strained to hear more. What we saw next made my blood run cold. Lanterns appeared in the distance, bobbing along the forest floor, illuminating the space between the trees. Figures emerged, draped in tattered white clothing, their faces hidden behind eerie masks that seemed to glow in the lantern light. Chains rattled as they walked, shackles on their wrists and ankles clanking with every step. The procession moved slowly, the figures gliding toward our hiding spot as if they were drawn by unseen force. My friends and I exchanged wide-eyed glances, a shared understanding of our predicament settling over us. We remained completely still, our hearts pounding in sync, the tension thick enough to slice through as they passed. I could see their eyes, or rather, where their eyes should have been. The masks were hollow, devoid of any expression, and I felt an overwhelming urge to scream, but managed to suppress it. The figures moved with a haunting grace, and I wondered if they even knew we were there. They continued on, fading into the depths of the woods, leaving us shaken and terrified. We waited for what felt like an eternity before we dared to move. Finally, we crept back to our camp, only to find it in disarray. The tents were overturned, and the fire pit was smoldering as if it had just been extinguished. Fear twisted in my stomach as we approached the campsite. A cold breeze whispered through the trees, sending chills down my spine. I noticed something on the ground, half hidden by the leaves. As I got closer, my stomach dropped. Scrawled in the dirt was a message: "You should not have come here." We all froze, the weight of that ominous sentence hanging heavily in the air. I felt a sense of dread wash over me, suffocating and relentless. We hastily gathered our things, adrenaline fueling our movements, and sprinted back to the car. Every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves had us glancing over our shoulders, terrified of what might be lurking in the shadows. Once inside the car, we locked the doors and started the engine. As we drove away, I looked back at the trees, the place where we had just been. That's when I saw them, those figures standing at the edge of the woods, illuminated by the moonlight. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching us leave. Later that night, once we were safely back in the city, I checked my phone. A notification lit up the screen. It was a message from Yena, sent while we were in the woods. "Did you see them? They're in the trees. They know we're here." I stared at the screen, confusion washing over me. Had she seen them too? I quickly typed back, asking her what she meant. I stared at the message, waiting for her response, but the screen went dark. Then, I heard it again, the faint clanking of chains in my mind, echoing, haunting. It wasn't over. The woods were not finished with us yet.